How It Feels to Die, by one who has tried it, and Other Stories, Grant Allen. How It Feels to Die, by one WHO has tried it. 1892. The July number of the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research contains some remarkable experiences by contributors who claim to have been at least temporarily dead. In both cases they allege that they passed into a new and conscious after-death existence. A well-known correspondent who also claims to have been practically dead sends us his experience, which, it will be seen, differs very considerably from those which are related in the Journal of the Psychical Society. All my life long I have been singularly destitute, I believe, of that physical shrinking from death which so many human beings feel so acutely. I do not mean that I am in any hurry to die. As long as things go on tolerably well with me in the world, I have no insuperable objection to continue living, but whenever I stand face to face with death, as has happened to me several times in the course of my career, I regard the prospect of annihilation with perfect equanimity. I can honestly declare that all such occasions my only doubts and fears have been for the safety and the pecuniary position of the survivors, especially of those more immediately dependent upon me. For myself, I have never felt one moment's disquietude, and I attribute this entire absence of fear of death to the unusual fact that I have once already tried dying, and found it by no means a painful or terrifying experience. I mean what I say quite literally. I have not the slightest hesitation in asserting that once in my life I really and truly died as dead as it is possible for a human being to die, that I was afterwards resurrected. I have felt and know the whole feeling of death, not part of it only, but the actual end of dying. I did not stop halfway, I died and was done with it. And when I came back to life again it was no mere case of a waking from which is foolishly called suspended animation, but a genuine revival, a restoration of vitality to a man as dead as he ever can be or will be. It happened in this wise, and, though it was a good many years since, I have still a most vivid recollection of every moment of it. I had been skating on a lake in a very cold country. I am intentionally vague because I do not desire to disclose my personality. The surface was smooth as glass, and perfectly free from snow or ridges. But, not far from where I was skating, some men had been cutting out great blocks of ice the day before, for summer use, and had neglected to mark the spot by a danger signal, as compelled by law, so as to prevent accidents. During the night this open space of blue water had frozen over slightly, perhaps an inch thick, forming a continuous sheet with the other and much thicker ice about it, so that from a little distance it was quite impossible to detect the difference. I skated incautiously from the solid ice onto this thinner piece, and, moving with considerable impetus, went through it at once, and was carried on under the thicker and firmer ice beyond it. The first thing I knew was that I found myself plunged suddenly into ice-cold water, and struggling for my life, in skates and winter clothes, against chill and drowning. I went down like lead. When I came up again, it was with my head against the solid ice. If I had had full possession of my faculties, I would have looked about for the hole by which I broke through and endeavored to swim under water for it. But I was numbed with the cold, and stunned with the suddenness of the unexpected ducking, so, instead of looking for the soft place by which I had got in, I tried ineffectually to break the thick ice over my head by bumping and butting against it. In so doing, I do not doubt, I must have made matters worse by partially stunning myself. At any rate, I could not break it, and was soon completely numbed by the cold. I gasped and swallowed a great deal of water. I felt my lungs filling. A moment of suspense, during which I knew perfectly well I was drowning, intervened, and then, I died. I was drowned and dead. I knew it then, and I have never since for a moment doubted it. Just before I died, however, I noticed, deliberately noticed, for I am psychological by nature, that my whole past life did not come up, as I had been given to understand it would, in a single flash before me. On the contrary, I felt only a sense of cold and damp and breathlessness, a fierce wild struggle, a horrible choking sensation, and then all was over. I was taken out stone dead. Unless extreme remedies had been applied, I would have remained stone dead till the present moment. If nothing more had been done, my body would have undergone no further change till decomposition set in. Heart and lungs had ceased to act, I was truly dead. There was nothing more that could happen to me to make me any deader. However, a friend who was skating with me raised the alarm, and I was shortly after pulled out again, still dead, with a boat hook. They tried artificial respiration, brandy, heat, all the recognized means of reviving a corpse after drowning. After a while, they brought me back. I began to breathe again. But I call it absurd to speak of my condition meanwhile as one of suspended animation. The phrase is unscientific. I was dead and nothing else. I did not doubt it at the time. I have never since doubted it. Mythological theorists may talk about something they call the soul not having yet left the body. I know nothing of all that, though I don't see how they can tell so confidently whether in such a case as mine the soul, if any, does not leave the body at once and then come back again. For all I know to the contrary, it may have gone meanwhile to the hypothetical place of departed spirits, always unconscious. But, to omit any such curious and unprofitable inquiries, what I do know is this, that if there had been no artificial respiration I would never have revived again, and my body would have undergone dissolution in due course, without any return of consciousness whatever. So far as consciousness goes, therefore, I was then and the dead, and I never expect to be any deader. And the knowledge that I have thus once experienced in my own person exactly what death is, and tried it fully, has had a great deal to do, I think, with my utter physical indifference to it. I know how it feels, and though it is momentarily uncomfortable, it isn't half as bad as breaking your arm or having a tooth drawn. In fact, the actual dying itself, as dying, is quite painless as falling asleep. It is only the previous struggle, the sense of its approach, that is at all uncomfortable. Even this is much less unpleasant than I should have expected beforehand, and I noted at the time that there was a total absence of any craven shrinking. The sensation was a mere physical one of gasping and choking. Whenever I have stood within a measurable distance of death ever since, my feeling has been always the same. I have been there already, and see no cause to dread it. Of course one might strongly object to a painful end, on account of its painfulness, and one might shrink, and ought to shrink, from leaving one's family, especially if young or insufficiently provided for, but death itself, as death, it seems to me, need have absolutely no terrors for a sensible person. Anon. Pall Mall Gazette, the 3rd of September 1892, 1-2, Muriel Stanley, Poacher, 1900. Muriel Stanley is a singular instance of the natural woman still surviving in our midst. And the natural woman is at war with our civilization. I never see poor Muriel without an inner shudder, when I think of the end to which fate and her own temperament must inevitably hurry her. That shapely brown neck, straight and firm as a column, is all too delicate for a rope. Yet a rope it will be, or I am no true prophet. When I say that Muriel is a natural woman I mean what I say, for good and for evil. See her leaning her elbows on the gate that leads from Sir Walter's copse out onto the heather-clad moorland, a tall, lithe figure, with keen, brown face, eager, wistful eyes, and wealth of black hair just peeping from beneath her pink and white sunbonnet, a bronzed woman of the people, quivering with suppressed emotion to the tips of the fingers, and you can guess at once the salient points of her character. Hers is the impassioned temperament, embodied in a sound and vigorous frame. Take her as a specimen of the natural woman, a savage still at heart, but a savage of the best type, capable of great love, great revenge, great devotion, great self-sacrifice, great crimes, great repentances, but not of anything mean or small or commonplace. The savage has in him, in the germ, all that the best and worst among civilized men have developed separately except one thing: consistency. He can rise to splendid heights of generosity and sink to the vile depths of cruelty and shame. But all is momentary. What he cannot compass is sustained action or sustained feeling. He is a creature of moral impulses, for good or bad. The passing mood, the passing emotion sway him. And Muriel is like that. She can love, she can hate, but she cannot be steadily or persistently anything. In spite of her strange name, she is not a gypsy. At least not consciously. Much gypsy blood lurks unknown in the wild region of Dorset, where the Stanleys live, and Muriel has associated with gypsies and poachers from her childhood upward. She can even patter Romany a little, though only as an outsider, but her people have long been settled in this district, and if ever they were members of the Stanley clan, have forgotten it long ago in all save their surname. As to her fantastic Christian name, Mariel, that came to her from an aunt, who inherited it in turn from 5 generations of female ancestors. Mariel was christened by that name, though the clergyman who baptized her tried hard to modernize and vulgarize it into Muriel, but her mother stood up stoutly against such newfangled nonsense. "'Twas always Mariel with the Stanleys and Tybholts," she said, with true pride of race. "Ever since I heard tell of my mould shall be Mariel, Parson Willet or Parson Nillet." And Mariel she was from that day onward. It may surprise you to learn that Mariel was ever christened at all, for when she was a bairn, the nearest church to Greydown was at Upton Parva, 7 long miles off across the moor as the crow flies, and the people of Greydown in those days fecked little in most ways of churches and parsons. "They were a barbarous folk up here, sir," Mariel's father said to me one day, in a rare burst of loquaciousness, for he is a silent man. "I don't suppose you'd have found a more barbarous folk anywheres in England, go 40 years back, than the Greydown people." And he was quite right. The hill itself stands mainly in Dorset, but it lies at the upper end of 3 river valleys, and at the junction of 3 shires, so for ages, it was the refuge of all the gypsies, the horse copers, the sheep stealers, the poachers, the miscellaneous riffraff and outlaws of the neighborhood. Nowadays, their descendants for the most part are honestly occupied in broom making and basket weaving, but they do not take readily to steady labor, preferring to be free and to be their own masters, a natural taste which I will confess I share with them. Nevertheless, even in their worst days of barbarism, the Greydowners always christened their children in church, and were married by parson. Not that they attached much religious importance to the rite in either case, but they liked the importance of it. That was the regular authorized way of doing things, and they would wish the settled folk down yonder at Upton to know that the Greydowners were every bit as good Christians any day as they were. Because you are a broom squire, that is no valid reason why you shouldn't behave like other civilized gentlefolk. "Then you really were christened Mariel?" I said to her once interrogatively. And she answered, half laughing, "Yes, I was christened all right, sir, but I don't suppose it took." And I think she was right. For a verier pagan than Mariel Stanley it would be hard to light upon. As a girl, she grew up on this high, wild moorland, running about shoeless and stockingless among the gorse and heather, and trapping leverets, and browning her shapely legs with paddling in the ponds after newts and tadpoles. To this day, she can tickle trout against any man in Dorsetshire. Her father's cottage lay among tall bracken in a valley or bottom just below the gibbet, that gibbet on which the murderers of the warfaring women were hung in chains 100 years ago, and which long remained a terror and a warning to evildoers, the sole symbol of civilization, repressive civilization, in these lonely uplands. You can tell the cottage from others about by the climbing red roses and by the great stacks of dry heather piled outside the door, and waiting to be made up into farmhouse brooms, such as used for rough work in yards and stables. Before Mariel was 10 years old, she knew as much about jays and weasels and hawks and foxes as Sir Walter's gamekeeper. She could show you the mottled brown eggs of the nightjar, lying loose on the bare ground without nest or shelter. She could find the wren's callow young and baby stoats in the copse. She had observed at what age the soft little hedgehogs begin to get their prickles hardened, and where the woodcock probed with their long, straight bills after grubs and worms in the soft, spongy moss of the peat-logged hollows. At 18, she was tall and beautiful, with wild, unkempt hair long and black and straight and wiry, without a suspicion of curl in it, recalling perhaps the remote Indian blood of her gypsy ancestors, once Jats of the Punjab. A handsomer girl of her wayward peasant type I have seldom seen. Let me try to describe her. Mariel's head is shapely and well poised on her shoulders, a trait which you will find almost always accompanies the impassioned character. Her neck is erect, and she carries herself proudly. The pose reminds me at times of the portraits of Dante. And indeed, though it may sound odd to compare this wild English moorland girl with the proud, sardonic Tuscan poet, I can recognize in essence a certain community of type between the two. Her eyes are dark and shy, but with sudden flashes in them. The eyebrows and eyelids are black and abundant. Her long, Straight hair flows down on her shoulders when loosed, as it often is, or else is gathered up into a great careless bunch at the back of the head, with folds covering the ears, which recall Charlotte Bronte. For her essentials, Mariel is just a Charlotte Bronte undeveloped. Her features are somewhat large, but soft in outline, her chin strong, her mouth had sensuous, thick lips, redeemed by the exquisite curve, like a Rossetti portrait. The hands are long and slender, the fingers have a curious tremulous movement, the whole emotion of the woman comes out in them at times, as it comes out in her heaving bosom, her flashing eye, her close-set lips, her strange wistful expression. She impresses me always as vaguely longing for something above her, something she has never known and never will know, something from which her class and her lack of education forever divide her. You must know Mariel pretty well, indeed, before you begin to suspect how much there is in her. Like most people of intensely passionate natures, she is not given to speech, her thoughts and feelings lie too deep for words, and even if her pride did not prevent her from saying at all times what she feels, her mere lack of vocabulary would suffice to keep her from voluble self-revelation. Nor is she by any means demonstrative. It is an error to suppose that emotional natures are necessarily given to expressing their emotion, either in words or gestures. The exact opposite would be truer. Emotion hides itself. Mariel's manners are quiet and reserved, she is not fitful or restless, you cannot often see how profoundly she is thinking or feeling. Only at rare moments does some accident reveal the real depth of her nature. Once I caught her at sunset by the two-step stile that leads from the moor into the Lammers fields. She did not hear me coming. I crept up behind her, admiring her lithe form, silhouetted against the red sky, as she leaned on the stile and gazed at the crimson and orange clouds before her. When I drew quite near, she turned round with a short sigh. To my surprise, I saw she had tears in her eyes. "That's a beautiful sky, Mariel," I said. She clasped her hands and answered, "Oh, beautiful, beautiful. A sky like that makes one cry, sir, don't it?" Then, as if she had let herself go too much, she turned and fled, like the wayward forest-haunting thing she is. For a month after, whenever she saw me, she seemed to slink on one side, as if ashamed of having let herself be discovered in the act of admiring nature. A girl of so deeply emotional a temperament could hardly grow up without loving much and loving often. The full wealth of her soul could only expend itself on those she loved profoundly. Even as a child, I remember, she used to creep out of the cottage on summer nights, and go to a spot in the copse where the badger nested. There the badger cubs would steal out, undeterred by the presence of that other wild creature, and play clumsily with their mother in the sober twilight. And Mariel adopted one and loved it, as other children would love a dog or a pigeon. The choice was significant. That sympathetic heart could waste its heart on the veriest bear. Perhaps it was well, for what sort of men could poor Mariel hope to captivate among the chair-menders and basket-makers of her wild moorland home? It is not the man that the woman really loves, especially such impassioned women as this. It is the ideal she makes of him. And a passionate character like Mariel's will erect a golden image of some gamekeeper or some groom, and bow down to it in secret as devotedly and as earnestly as a lady will bow down to her dissolute dragoon or her worthless, drunken cross-country rider. Idealism works this miracle. It is as easy to idealize a laborer or a navvy as an insipid curate or a sneering stockbroker. When Mariel was 16, her passion was for the footman at the great house in the valley, the footman with blue livery and padded cuffs, who spent half the year at the town house in Mayfair and half at Greydown. Not that she ever told her love, it was not the way of girls like Mariel to wear their hearts upon their sleeves. I would doubt if anybody save myself, who am a novelist by trade, and therefore observant of these little signs of emotion, ever so much as guessed it. But day by day, when Alfred was about, Mariel would hover near the gate of the great house, waiting and watching, amply repaid if the hero of her young love came out on his way to the village on some errand, and gave her a passing nod and a good day, young woman. She gloated over his livery. I feel sure, gloated over it with the admiration which an earl's daughter feels for a hero's uniform. But Alfred went away some months later to better himself at Brighton, and after mourning him for 6 weeks, Mariel fell a victim to the charms of the stalwart young policeman who arrested Ted Vaughan for causing incendiary heath fires at Highdown Firs. This, of course, was sheer treason to her class. Family honor intervened. Septarius Stanley, her father, was the friend and associate of gypsies, and poachers, and tramps, and horse stealers. He could hardly let his daughter consort uncensured with a mere policeman. And the young policeman, himself, was not likely to care for so disreputable a connection. In the essence of things, it is true, Mariel was as far above him as a poetess is above an ordinary young city man, but the essence of things, I fear, counts for little or nothing in matrimonial matters. Mariel had to give up her stalwart policeman, and console herself later on with Ted Vaughan himself, when that noble young savage came gaily out of prison. But every man and every woman had one great love in a lifetime, and after many lesser trial trips, Mariel Stanley found hers at last in Joe Arundel, the poacher. You may laugh, but I can tell you an affection like Mariel Stanley's is no laughing matter. The fact that she could idealize a great hulking rowdy and bully like Joe is in itself a strong proof of the woman's deep poetic nature. Outwardly tranquil of demeanor, a dreamer and brooder, Mariel has yet a profound admiration such as the natural woman always feels for the man of courage and the man of action. Do you remember Homer's Andromache? She is the true type of the impassioned woman of these lower grades and lower races, the woman who can love and endure much, to whom crime and bloodshed are but natural attributes of the hero she worships. Hector had attacked the town where Andromache lived, had sacked and burned it, and slain her father and mother, and had carried her off as his wife after the primitive mode of marriage by capture. And did Andromache hate him for these deeds of violence with all her soul? Not a bit of it. She accepted such little episodes as part of the established order of things, and clung to her Hector, and loved and cherished him, and worshipped him with a worship passing that of the willing chooser. But Hector, she says to him in that immortal passage which has stirred the hearts of 1,000 generations, but Hector, thou to me art father and mother, and thou to me beloved husband. Mariel Stanley is a survivor of barbarism cast in the same mold. She could have worshipped the man who stole her from her home and slew her parents, if only he had qualities she could respect and idealize. Now Joe Arundel, the poacher, was the whispered terror of his own neighborhood. From childhood up, Mariel had heard all her own set admire and describe with glowing praise the bold acts of this brave and sullen desperado. Joe had been 3 separate times in prison, a proud distinction. He was even gravely suspected of having murdered the gamekeeper, whose corpse was found wrapped up in faded leaves at the bottom of the chestnut copse by Dead Man's Hollow. Joe did not admit the impeachment, but neither did he reject it. He tossed his head and looked arrogant whenever the subject was alluded to in his presence. Too proud to deny, too cautious to boast. Mariel would stand by and admire him silently. It was not Mariel's way to be demonstrative either of affection or admiration. Only by the quick twitch of her bloodless fingers, by the knitted brow, by the eyes steadily fixed on her chosen hero could one tell how immense was her admiration for the man who had defied the whole banded power of the law and the county, and exposed himself to the risk of a rope for his last portion. Her fists would clench themselves till the nails dug into the palms and almost drew blood, while Joe talked in dark hints of some little brush with Sir Walter's keepers, or vaguely alluded with picturesque mistiness of thought and languages to some fight with the police over a brace or 2 of pheasants. For, brought up as she had been, passionate rebelliousness was almost a necessary feature of Mariel Stanley's character. She hates law and order with the natural hatred of a hunted creature. What have they ever done for her and hers save harry them into prison, or hound them to the workhouse? The gentry in her eyes are so many oppressors of her wild, free kind, they would drive all the world from the heath and the copse into service or the factories. Mariel wants none such. For her, the open moor and the wide air of heaven. Joe, for his part, did not readily discover that Mariel was in love with him. Joe is not by nature an intuitive creature. He can read the tracks of bird and beast in the snow far more easily than he can read the marks of human feeling or human passion. And Mariel is the sort of girl to fling herself at any man. She falls in love, it is true, easily and rapidly. Her passions have the barbaric quickness and certainty. Almost at sight, she says I love that man, or I do not. But she says it to herself alone. Torture would not draw from her the overt confession. In that, once more, she is thoroughgoing savage. Your savage woman loves desperately, but in silence. She is coy and wayward. She flies like a squirrel from him who pursues, and then turns and smiles, not because she wishes to escape, but because some deep instinct of her race teaches her that to fly is the proper part of woman. But I could see from an early point in this growing passion how Mariel was letting her love for Joe swallow up her entire nature. She would sit on the logs by her father's house when Joe came round, with her strong, small chin poised on her open hand, and listened while Joe talked to Septarius Stanley, as rapt as if Joe's few jerky, inarticulate sentences were the purest flowers of human eloquence. Did ever man talk like Joe? Did ever man look like him? 6'2", though a trifle hulking and shambling in gait, I must admit, with a scar on the left cheek, won in open fight with those oppressors of the human race, the police, and with courage enough to go on to the bitter end, till fate landed him at last in that lofty position in death he was bound to occupy. Mariel looked and sighed. He was a king among poachers. Night after night she would creep out by the copses where Joe might be found, and as he skulked past her with his bleary-eyed ferret, would suggest to him casually in a careless voice where the best pheasants were likely to be found, or point out which path the keeper had last taken on his evening round through the chestnut plantation. She knew as much of woodland lore as Joe himself, I fancy, and Joe accepted her hints with ungraceful country awkwardness. Still, he thought her a knowing one, and told her so sometimes. Mariel's brown cheek flushed red through the russet at words of praise from her hero's lips. Anybody but a fool or Joe would have known she was in love. But Joe, though a sharp hand at a trap or a net, is not remarkable for the quickness of his instincts. At last one evening, as they stood together by the copse, the merry small rabbits gambolling all around them and the corncrake rattling, Mariel told him some points she had observed about the hare's forms in the heath, a new wrinkle even to the experienced poacher. Joe gazed at her and smiled from ear to ear with expansive appreciation. "Mariel maid," he said slowly, with open mouth and hanging lip, "I do know a thing or two, I do. The hind three maids on Grey Downhill knows as much as thee, maid. If thee and me was to come together, us'll do a good trade in the poachin', wouldn't us?" Mariel's heart beat high, Mariel's cheek flushed crimson. He had recognized her at last. Then, this prince of men had spoken. She drew away a step or two, with her quick squirrel glance. "Don't he talk like that, Joe?" she said, and gave a little toss of the proud black head, yet her voice was tender. "I hind one for the men. Aim all deceivers." It dawned across Joe as she withdrew her face, that Mariel really liked him. Joe was a ladies' man in his way, but his way was not Mariel's. He slipped his arm round her waist. Mariel tried to evade him, though it was a formal evasion. The proud heart was won long ago. Tears stood in Mariel's eyes. Joe Arundel had chosen her. After that they met nightly on the moor among the tall green gorse, or else in the copse where Joe killed the keeper. That thrill of romance and terror suited Mariel's fancy well. She felt about the copse as some Homeric maiden of Ilion might have felt about the spot where her lover had slain in open fight a mighty man among the Myrmidon. Educated and cultivated, she would have wandered by herself and read Shelley and Rossetti. As it was, she stole off to meet Joe in the copse which had been the scene of his greatest and the most successful encounter with the despotic forces. By and by, she began to talk to him tentatively of marriage. Joe didn't think much of that. Joe was not by nature a marrying man. He took it they might get along well enough by themselves without the parson and the parson's fees. But there, Mariel's will was iron. All the Stanleys from all time had been duly married in church, and she wouldn't go back upon the tradition of the family. "Parson to Upton Parva won't want to marry we," Joe objected, grinning. "Then us can go to Exeter," Mariel answered with grave earnestness, "but married I will be, and to none but thee, Joe Arundel." After that, Joe felt that there was naught for it but to give way. He gave way with a bad grace, and entered a church for the first time since his christening. "It pleases her and it don't hurt me," was the explanation he gave to his poaching pals of his unsportsmanlike conduct. At the same time he made it clearly understood that he did not mean to let his new state seriously interfere with his manner of living. Once married, Mariel went on loving her worthless husband with the unvarying and incredible devotion of an impassioned nature. Nothing he could do to her seemed to alter her affection. Her man might come home drunk and beat her, that was only natural, men are built that way, and was it not to be expected that a splendid creature like Joe, 6'2" in his shoeless feet, and broad-shouldered to match, should knock about a weak woman who loved and admired him? Mariel was no shrew. Souls capable of deep feeling are seldom scolds. She endured it all and worse because it was Joe's pleasure. Her first baby came. Mariel positively idolized it, her baby, Joe's baby. I doubt if any child in the squire's nursery was ever so much made of as the poacher's brown boy, with his father's eyes, and black hair like his mother's. Not that she talked of her little one much. Mariel never talked much about anything that moved her inmost soul. She had learned to do without sympathy. But one day as I passed her cottage in the glen, she was seated on a log outside the porch where red roses clambered, holding out a foxglove spike to please her baby. "That's a fine boy, Mariel," I said, looking at him. Tears came into her eyes once more. "Yes, he's a tidy little man, sir," she answered, holding him up to be admired. "They do tell me he favors Joe." And she said it as she might have said he resembles the prince, his father. The fierce, suppressed earnestness of her tone fairly touched me. "I never saw a prettier baby in my life," I replied. She looked up at me, a shy glance with gratitude in her eyes, but she answered nothing. Her thoughts were too deep for such words as she knew. Only a poet could have uttered what was passing within her. I said at the beginning I could never see Mariel without an inner shudder at the fate which is in store for her. What fate? You ask. Well, it seems to me inevitable. I have a sort of premonition of the very way it will come. Some day, Joe will get into a quarrel with some other man about a woman, their other man's wife, and Mariel's rival. The two will fight, and the other man, being quicker though less powerful than Joe, will get him down and hold him. Then Mariel will rush in to her faithless husband's aid, and stab his assailant. She would never stab her rival, she is too proud for that, but she would stab the man who for her rival's sake dared attack her hero. The rest follows, of course. And those who read the report of the trial in the papers will only know that a poacher's wife, a very bad lot, the daughter and associate of criminals, was sentenced to death for murdering a man her good-for-nothing husband had been quarreling. But I know all, and in some dim way, I can feel for poor Mariel. Mariel Stanley, Poacher, by Grant Allen, transcribed from the Washington Post, January 14, 1900, p. 27, by Victor A. Birch, a study from the Nude, 1895. Harley Binns smoked a short clay pipe. His studio was at Kensington. He painted ideal female figures, and he painted them exquisitely. He was thick-set, bullet-headed, bull-necked, vociferous. You would have known him at first sight for a successful artist. Harley Binns had a friend who worked in the studio with him. His name was Walter Hazelton. He also had a model for the Nude, a splendid girl, one of the finest in London. He was proud of his model. Her name was Emily. She was Miss Higgs in public, but in the studio it ran to Emily. One day, Harley Binns was strolling casually through the high street when Emily came toward him, walking with another girl. Harley Binns, as it chanced, was not only successful, but also an artist. His eye picked out that girl immediately. She had a superb figure, lithe, rounded, proportioned, the figure one paints, one imagines, one dreams about. He could interpret its subtle curves through her simple black dress, for 'twas Harley Binns' trade mentally to disrobe the female form divine as it deployed itself in bodice and skirt before him. This girl's at once attracted him. It wasn't only that its outlines and proportions were perfect. You can get mere mechanical and measurable perfection by paying for them any day. It was that the figure had soul in it. For there is soul, too, in figures. Harley Binns looked at her face. 'Twas a born lady's face, delicate, beautiful, tender. By Jove, he said to himself in an artistic rapture, I'd give £10 to paint that girl. If I'd a model like that, Burns-Jones himself would go mad with envy. He paused as she passed, and looked after her. Then, with just a moment's hesitation, he turned again and overtook them. He touched Emily with one hand. I say, he cried, with a meaning look, I want to speak to you. The other girl walked modestly on with a shy glance at the stranger, but Emily turned around to him, wholly unabashed. Well, you can't get her then, she said promptly. jumping at his meaning at once, with instinctive quickness. You are not the first by a great many that has wanted her. But she don't care to sit. She's my cousin, she is. She's been brought up to the drapery. There's plenty more have asked her, and she's always refused. It's no good trying. You won't sit, will you, Clara? A dainty blush, such as Harley Binns have never before seen upon a human face, suffused the girl's face as she answered hastily, "Oh, please don't, Emily. However can you?" Harley Binns was more eager than before when he saw that rich color. Blush rose on white lily. It was exquisite, unapproachable. He drew Emily aside a little. "Look here, my child," he said quietly, in his most persuasive voice, "I'll give your cousin 3 times the usual fee if ever she'll sit to me, and I'll give you a £10 note for yourself the day you first bring her round to me at the studio." The girl nodded and went away. From that day forth, time after time, Harley Binns asked her, "Well, how about Clara?" And time after time the model shook her head. "It's no good," she answered, with some slight contempt. "Clara's a Philistine, that's where it is. She's dreadful prejudiced." For she had picked up to some extent the slang of the studio. Harley Binns was piqued. So was Emily, too. To both of them it seemed little short of absurd that a girl who waited behind the counter at a petty draper's shop in a back street should give herself the airs and graces of a duchess. "Why, there's plenty o' duchesses as you'd sit themselves, if it comes to that, as soon as look at it," Emily observed, pouting. "They understand the aims of art," Harley Binns responded, adding a touch to the left shoulder. "What can you expect, after all, from a draper's assistant?" A month or 2 went by. Then one day at last Emily began to hint that things were not going well in Clara's family. Her mother was a widow, and her rent was in arrears. The children were short of food. Next day still better, an execution threatened. Harley Binns saw his chance, and proceeded to take it. He instructed Emily to make a more tempting offer to her cousin than ever. That very afternoon, the draper, as it chanced, had words with Clara. He dismissed her for a month. How exceedingly lucky. She could not hold out long. And next morning, in effect, Emily came round to the painter with good news, indeed. Clara's mother was seriously ill and under stress of compulsion ruin staring her in the face. Clara had consented to earn an honest penny by sitting in the nude to him. Harley Binns and Walter Hazelton were all agog with excitement. At 11 o'clock, timid, shrinking, terrified, the new model crept in, and still more crimson than before, retired with shame behind the screen to disrobe herself. That is the model's modesty. She undresses in private. Emily sat by her side to encourage the novice and accustom her to the ordeal. And when the dreaded moment fairly came, and she stood there nude and trembling, with her face in her hands, it was Emily who pushed her forward, more dead than alive, before the discreet curtain. Harley Binns had guessed right. His breath came and went. She was an ideal model. As he stood and gazed, waiting to begin a study of her figure in the delicious pose she herself had unconsciously adopted, a curious sight attracted his attention. The girl was blushing. Not with her face only, that would have been nothing new, but with her whole live body. A great wave of red passed over it, undulating, then a great wave of white, then red again rhythmically. It was wonderful, beautiful. Harley Binns seized his brushes, his sketching pad, his watercolors. "That's perfect," he cried in artistic rapture. "If only I could that effect on canvas, Walter. I should feel I wasn't afraid of Titian's Venus." The girl writhed in terror. She stood there fixed, immovable. "Let me go," she cried, shrinking back. I didn't mean it. I was driven to it. I didn't know what it was like." "Oh, how can you be so cruel?" Walter Hazelton gazed hard at her. He was an unsuccessful artist. "Let her go, Binns," he cried, compassionate. "We ought never to have made her do it. She's a sensitive little thing. She's too good for a model." But Harley Binns, unmoved, went on sketching those strange alternating waves of red and white. You must remember them, of course, on his marvelous first sitting in last year's new gallery. They coursed over the girl's body still, like ripples over a mill pond. "No, no," he answered, drawing a long puff at his stumpy clay pipe. "Now I've got her, I'll keep her. It isn't likely I'd let her go after this, till I'm done with her. She's perfect, that's what she is. I wouldn't give her up now, not for £100. Why, she's worth every penny of it. For God's sake, the girl cried, cowering, still chained to the spot. Oh, Emily, govern me. Throw something or other over me. But Harley Binns shook his head and still went on sketching. Her pose was just exquisite, no art, all that nature. And those shrinking virginal limbs. And that fervor of modesty. It was the picture he wanted, all making itself of itself without his aid or effort. He was charmed and delighted. Put more coal on, Walter, he said, puffing away. She's beginning to shiver. He sketched for nearly an hour. And all that time the poor girl stood riveted, in an agony of shame, despair and horror. At last she mustered up courage to say, I can't stand it any more. You must let me go now. That's enough till tomorrow. Then Harley Binns let her go. She'd done quite as much as one can reasonably expect the first day for the day figure. The model slunk her off behind the screen with furtive terror. Emily helped her to muddle on her clothes again somehow. She came out fully dressed, save for her self-respect, but she missed that strangely. Good morning, Harley Binns said in his cool way, here's your money, cash down. You were frightened, I know. You'll get used to it in time. The girl's hand closed over the coin mechanically and dreamily. It was all for her mother. Yes, I'll get used to it in time, I suppose, she murmured, half dazed. And so out into the open street, and away in reeling fear from that hateful studio. All day long, when she was gone, Harley Binns worked hard, like one inspired, at touching up the study. He surpassed himself in delicacy. He saw her still before him. He saw those living waves course crimson through her body. If the worst came to worst, from these first rough hints alone, he could manage with care to work up a picture. Next morning at 11 Emily opened the studio door, white-faced. Harley Binns gazed at her in surprise. Hello, he cried, how's this? I say, child, where's the other one? She ain't coming this morning, Emily answered, doggedly. Not coming this morning? The painter repeated, drawing back, and holding his breath. Why, I've not half done with her, but you've done for her. Emily retorted, looking hard into his cold blue eyes. She ain't never coming again. She's gone raving mad in the night, and they've taken her to an asylum. A study from the nude, by Grant Allen, transcribed from the Washington Post, March 17, 1895, p. 22, by Victor A. Birch. My One Gorilla, 1890. I looked up from my beetles. The night was warm. A naked little black girl crossed the dusty main street of the village just in front of my hut, carrying in her hand what seemed to me in the gloaming the largest blossom I had ever observed since my arrival in Africa. That was a blossom. It looked like an orchid, pale cream color in hue, and very fantastic and bizarre in shape, but what specially attracted my attention at first was its peculiar shining and glistening effect, like luminous paint, which made it glow in the grey dusk with a sort of phosphorescent light such as one observes in tropical seas on calm summer evenings. To a naturalist, of course, such a vision as that was simply irresistible. Hello, there, little girl. I cried out in Fantee, which I had learned by that time to speak pretty fluently. Let me look at your flower, will you? Where on earth did you get it? But instead of answering me civilly, like a Christian child, the scared little savage, alarmed at my white face, set up a wild howl of terror and amazement, and bolted off down the street at the top of her speed, as fast as her small bandy legs would carry her. Well, science is science. I wasn't to be balked of a unique specimen for my great collection by a trick like that. So, flinging away my cigarette and darting out of my hut, I gave chase incontinently, and rushed, full pelt, down the main street of Tulamba, helter-skelter and devil-take the hindmost, in pursuit of my 10-year-old. But I reckoned without my host. Children of the Gaboon beat the record for the quarter-mile. I was quite pumped out and panting for breath before I ran that girl to the earth at last, by her mother's door at the far end of the village. A dozen more of the Negroes, loitering about on their backs in the dust of the street, had joined the hue and cry with great gusto by that time. They didn't know, to be sure, what the fuss was about, but given a white man bestower of rum and money rushing in mad pursuit, and a poor little frightened black girl scampering away for dear life at the top of her speed, in abject bodily terror, and you may confidently reckon on the chivalry of the gaboon to range itself automatically on the side of the stronger, and to drive the unhappy small child hopelessly into a very bad corner. When at last I got up with the object of my quest, she was so alarmed and blown with her headlong career that I felt thoroughly ashamed of myself. Even the pursuit of science, I will frankly admit, hardly justified me in so chivying that frightened little mortal, 10 negroes strong, through the street of Talamba. However, a bright English sixpence, a red silk pocket handkerchief, and the promise of a box of European sweets from the old half-caste Portuguese trader's shop in the village, soon restored her confidence. Unhappily, it did not restore that broken and draggled, but priceless, orchid. In her headlong flight, the child had crumpled it hopelessly up in her hand, and distorted it almost beyond the possibility of scientific recognition. All I could make out with certainty now was that the orchid belonged to a new and hitherto undescribed species, that it was large and luminous and extremely beautiful, and that if only I could succeed in securing a plant of it, my name was made as a scientific explorer. The natives crowded round with disinterested advice, and eyed the torn and draggled blossom curiously. "It's a moonflower," they said in their own dialect. "Very rare. Hard to get. Comes from the deep shades in the great forest. How did you come by it, my child?" I asked, coaxingly, of my sobbing little 10-year-old. "My father brought it in," the child answered, with a burst. "He gave it to me a week ago. He was out in the country of the dwarfs, doing trade. He went for ivory, and he brought this back to me." "Boys," I cried to the negroes who crowded round, looking on, "do you know where it lives? I want to get one. A good English rifle to any man in Talamba who guides me to the spot where I can pick a live moonflower." The men shook their heads and shrugged their shoulders dubiously. "Oh, no," they all answered, like supers at the theater, with one accord. "Too far. Too dangerous." "Why dangerous?" I cried, laughing. "The moonflower won't bite you." "Who says danger in picking a flower?" My head guide and hunter stood out from the crowd, and looked across at me, awestruck. "Oh, Excellency," he said, in a hushed and frightened voice. "The moonflower is rare, it is very scarce, it grows only in the dark forest of the inner land where the Njina dwells. No man dare pick it for fear of the Njina." Oh, said I. "Is that so, my friend? Then I'm not astonished. For Njina, as no doubt you're already aware, is the native West African name for the gorilla. Well, I took home the poor draggled blossom to my hut, dissected it carefully, and made what scientific study was possible of its unhappy remains in their much tattered condition. But for the next 10 days, as you can readily believe, I could think and talk and dream of nothing but moonflowers. You can't think what a fascination it exerts on a naturalist explorer's mind, a new orchid like that, as big round as a dessert plate, and marked by so extraordinary and hitherto unknown a peculiarity in plants as phosphorescence. For the moonflower was phosphorescent, of that I had now not the shadow of a doubt. Its petals gave out by night a faint and dreamy luminousness, which must have made it shine like a moon indeed in the dense dark shade of a tropical African forest. The more I inquired of the natives about this new plant, the more was my curiosity piqued to possess one. I longed to bring a root of the marvelous bloom to Europe. For the natives all spoke of it with a certain hushed awe or superstitious respect. "It is Njina's flower," they said. "It grows in dark places, the gardens of Njina. If any man breaks one off, that is very bad luck, then Njina will surely overtake and destroy him." This superstitious awe only inflamed my desire to possess a root. The negroes' stories showed the moonflower to be really a most unique species. I gathered from what they told me that the blossom had a very long spur or sac, containing honey at its base in great quantities, that it was fertilized and rifled by a huge evening moth, whose proboscis was exactly adapted in length to the spur and its nectary, that it was creamy white in order to attract the insect's eyes in the gray shades of dusk, and that, for the self-same reason, its petals were endowed with the strange quality of phosphorescence, till now unknown in the vegetable kingdom, while it exhaled by night a delicious perfume, strong enough to be perceived at some 20 yards distance. So great a prize to a man of my tastes was simply irresistible. I made up my mind that, come what might, I must, could and would possess a tuber of the moonflower. 1 fortnight sufficed for me to make my final plans. Heavy bribes overcame the scruples of the Negroes. The promise of a good rifle induced the first finder of the first specimen to take service with me as a guide. Fully equipped for a week's march, and well attended with followers all armed to the teeth, I made my start at last for the home of the moonflower. To cut a long story short, we went for 3 days into the primeval shade of the great equatorial African forest. Dense roofs of foliage shut out the light of day. Underfoot, the ground was encumbered with thick, tropical brushwood. We crept along cautiously, hacking our way at times among the brake with our cutlasses, and crawling at others through the deep tangle of the underbrush on all fours like monkeys. During all those 3 days we never caught sight of a single moonflower. They were growing very rare nowadays, my guide explained in most voluble Fantee. When he was a mere boy, his father found dozens of them, but now, why, you must go miles and miles through the depths of the forest and never so much as light on a specimen. At last, about noon on the 4th day out, we came upon a torrent, rushing with great velocity among huge boulders, and sending up the spray of its boiling rapids into the trees of the neighborhood. I sat down to rest, meaning to mix the water from the cool, fresh stream with a spoonful or two of cognac from the flask in my pocket. As I drank it, I tossed back my head and looked up. Something on one of the trees hard by attracted my eyes strangely. A parasite stood out boldly from a fork of the branches, bearing a long, lithe spray of huge luminous flowers as big as dessert plates. My heart gave a bound. The prize was within sight. I pointed my finger in silence to the tree. All the Negroes with one voice raised a loud shout of triumph. Their words rent the air. The moonflower, the moonflower. I felt myself for a moment a perfect Stanley or Duchaelu. I had discovered the most marvelous and beautiful orchid known to science. In a moment I had tossed off my brandy, laid down my rifle, and mounting on the back of one of my Negro porters, was swinging myself up to the lowest branch of the tree where my new treasure shone resplendent in its own dim phosphorescence. I couldn't have trusted any hand but my own to pick or egg out that glorious tuber. I meant to cut it bodily from the bark as it stood, and bear it back in triumph in my own arms to Tilamba. I had climbed the tree cautiously, and was standing almost within grasp of the prize, when a sudden shout among my followers below startled and discomposed me. I looked down and hesitated. My brain reeled and sickened. A strange sight met my eyes. My Negroes, one and all, had taken to their feet down the bed of the stream at the very top of their speed, and were making a most unanimous and inexplicable stampede toward the direction of Tilamba. For a moment I couldn't imagine what had happened to disconcert them. There, casting my glance casually towards the spot where I had flung down my rifle, I became aware at once of the cause of this commotion. Their retreat was well timed. By the moss-clad boulders which filled the bed of the torrent, somebody with a big, black face and huge grinning teeth, was standing erect, looking up at me and laughing. I had never seen the somebody's awful features before, but I had no need, for all that, to ask myself his name. I paused face to face with the live male gorilla. For a moment or two, the creature gazed up at me and grinned. Then he raised my rifle in his arms, held it clumsily before him, and, to my intense surprise, taking a very bad aim, or, rather pointing it aimlessly in the air, pulled both triggers with one hand, and discharged the 2 barrels at me with one pull, simultaneously. The bullets whizzed past me some 10 yards off. They knocked off the twigs beyond my precious moonflower. Well, I don't deny, as I say, that I was in a state of blue funk at the creature's gigantic and almost supernatural powers. But still, the moonflower was at stake, and I wouldn't desert it. I was so horribly frightened that I don't believe wife, or child, or fatherland, or freedom would have induced me to stay one moment alone in such dire extremities. But when it comes to orchids, well, I say no more than that I am above all things a scientific explorer. Each of us has his weakness, and mine is a flower. That touches my heart. For that alone can I be wrought up to the utmost pitch of daring conceivable or possible for me. So I looked at the huge brute, and I looked at the moonflower. slowly and cautiously, gazing down all the time as I went to watch the creature's face. I crept along the branch, took my knife from my pocket, and began to loosen the bark all round the spot where the glorious parasite was all growing and all blowing. The gorilla, from below, stood watching me and roaring. His roar seemed like an invitation to come down and fight. I never in my life heard anything so awfully human in its deep bass roll. It reminded me of the lowest notes of the stage villain in the Italian operas, magnified, so to speak, 200 diameters. Presently, as I went on cutting away the bark, as if for dear life, and loosening the precious tuber, my gorilla, who still remained motionless by his moss-clad boulder, left off his roaring, and appeared to grow interested in the process of the operation. A change came o'er the spirit of his dream. He looked up and wondered, with vague brute curiosity, not unmixed with a certain strange air of low cunning and intelligence. It was clear to me as mud that he was saying to himself inwardly, "Why doesn't the fellow cut and run for his life? Does he think I don't know how to climb a tree? Does he imagine that I couldn't be up there in a jiffy if I liked to choke or scrag him? What the dickens does he go on hacking away at the bark so quietly like that for, when he ought to be all agog to save his own bacon?" I despaired of explaining to so rude a creature the imperative nature of scientific need. So with one eye on the orchid and one on the brute, at the risk of contracting a permanent squint for life, I continued to egg out that magnificent moonflower, root and branch and tuber. The longer I went on, the closer and more attentively did the gorilla take stock of all my acts and movements. "Well, I declare," I could see him say to himself in the gorilla tongue, opening wide his huge eyes and elevating in surprise his shaggy, brown eyebrows, "such an animal as this I never yet did come across. He isn't one bit afraid, apparently, of me, the redoubtable and redoubted king of the great Gaboon forest." But I was, most consumedly, for all that, though I pretended not to be. Nothing but the presence before my eyes of that magnificent plant would have induced me for one moment to face or confront the unspeakable brute there. At last I had finished, and held my specimen in my hands entire. The next question now was what to do with it. I walked slowly and cautiously along the branch of the tree. The gorilla, with his eyes now fixed curiously on the moonflower, put forth one hairy leg in front of the other, and grinning with a sort of diabolical, brutish good humor, walked, step for step, on the ground, just as cautiously beneath me. I came to the end of the bough, and reached the point where interlacing branches enabled me to get onto another tree. I did so somewhat clumsily, for I was handicapped by the moonflower. The gorilla, still grinning, looked up, and remarked in his own tongue, "I could do that lot, I can tell you, a jolly sight better than you do." As he smiled those words, I half lost my balance, and, clinging still to my moonflower in my last chance for life, lowered myself slowly, hand over hand, to the ground in front of him. With a frightful roar, the creature sprang upon me and made a wild grab at my precious moonflower. That was more than human nature could stand. I turned and fled, carrying my specimen with me. But my pursuer was too quick. He caught me up in a moment. His scowling black face was ghastly to behold, his huge, white teeth gleamed fierce and hideous, his brawny, thick hands could have crushed me to a jelly. I panted and paused. My heart fluttered fast, there stood still within me. There was a second's suspense. At its end, to my infinite horror, he seized not me, oh no, not me. I might have put up with that, but the priceless moonflower. I was helpless to defend myself. Helpless to secure or safeguard my treasure. He took it from me with a grin. I could see through those sunken eyes what was passing in the creature's dim and brutal brain. He was saying to himself, like men at his own low grade of cunning, if that tuber was worth so much pains to him to get it, it must be worth just as much to me to keep. So, by your leave, my friend, if you'll excuse me, I'll take it. I stood appalled and gazed at him. The brute snatched that unique specimen of a dying or almost extinct genus in his swarthy, hairy hands of his, raised it bodily to his mouth, crushing and tearing the beautiful petals in his coarse grasp as he went at it slowly through tuber, stem, spray, blossom, and swallowed it conscientiously, with a hideous grimace, to the very last morsel. I had but one grain of consolation or revenge. It was clear the taste was exceedingly nasty, Then he looked in my face and burst into a loud, discordant laugh. That laugh was hideous. Aha! It said in effect, so that's all you've got, my fine fellow, after all, for all your pains, and care, and trouble. I shut my eyes and waited. My turn would come next. He would rend me in his rage for the nastiness of the taste. I stood still and shuddered. But, alas, he meant only to eat the moonflower. When I opened my eyes again, the brute had turned his back without one word of apology, and was walking off at a leisurely pace in contemptuous triumph, shrugging his shoulders as he went, and chuckling low to himself in his vulgar dog-in-the-manger joy and malignancy. It was 4 days before I straggled alone, half dead, into Tilamba. I never came across another of those orchids. And that is why at Kew they have still no moonflower. My One Gorilla, by Grant Allen. Transcribed by Victor A. Birch from Lloyd's Weekly newspaper, August 10, 1890. The Trade of Author, 1889, I. The question must doubtless often have obtruded itself upon every reflective and philosophic mind, which is but a gracefully oblique periphrasis for describing the readers of this present article. How does it happen that the trade of author, a most innocent craft, is so much worse paid and so much more hardly worked than any other respectable calling? I don't mean, of course, gravely to inquire, in this age of enlightenment, how it comes to pass that the journeyman writer fails to receive the princely remuneration accorded to great commercial chiefs or financial operators. Naturally, we couldn't expect to be paid on the same proud scale as a sugar broker or a stock jobber. We have not so learned political economy in these latter times as not to be well aware of the profound gulf that separates nature's nobleman, the capitalist and the landowner, from the common ruck of mere wage-earning humanity. No. The point I wish to raise here is simply this: how does it arrive at the wage of the average author, usually a person of some little education and some modest intelligence, falls so infinitely below the average wage of the other learned professions to which in like manner men bring but their brains and the skill of their fingers, so infinitely below the wage of a successful barrister, for example, or of the successful doctor, or of the successful parson, or of the successful artist? Envisaged merely as a problem of social economics, this question surely may give us pause for a few minutes in a world which still, after a non-committing fashion, honors literature almost up to the point of regarding its laborers as worthy of their higher market price, 2 guineas per thousand. Nor am I speaking now of the literary failures. In every profession there are, of course, dullards, idlers, and still more unfortunates, to whom luck never brings the chance of success, and the profession of letters is fuller of these, I imagine, than any other existing profession. Half the ablest writers in England are wasting their energies daily, I do not doubt, on very ill-paid and laborious journalistic handicraft. They are writing paragraphs. But then similar accidents happen elsewhere. Perhaps many a mute inglorious Eldon lingers among the briefless barristers in the classic recesses of Old Square, as able as any of those that wear silk. Many a Sydenham loiters late in remote villages, as clever as any of those that draw their 1,000 guineas a day for inspecting royal and imperial larynxes. Many an actor struts provincial boards as gifted as those who draw down the plaudits of cultivated London at the Savoy or the Lyceum. It is not of these, however, that I now speak, but of the comparatively successful and well-known authors, the mass of the recognized trade of writers, who still toil on, year after year, on a smaller pittance than the country lawyer, with less prospects of success than the country curate, and with far harder hours than the country surgeon. See, first, how incongruous is this disproportion. If you want to employ a barrister in your case, whose name is known as a special authority only to your solicitor, you will be surprised to find when you come to inquire that his brief is marked 100 guineas. If you go to the specialist recommended for your complaint by your medical director, you will see that he reckons the value of his casual conversation at something like 25 shillings the minute. If you desire to buy a watercolor picture by an obscure member of the Institute or a young exhibitor at the New Gallery, you will have to pay some £30 down for a square of paper 12 inches by 20. But when you begin to inquire into the income of writers whose works we read, to borrow the famous phrase of a sister in the craft, from Tobolsk to Tangier, or whose books may be bought in paper covers, probably pirated, at Valparaiso and Petropavlovsky, You discover to your astonishment the strange and seemingly inconsistent anomaly, that the man known to half the world in a dozen countries is earning about 1/20th of the income earned by the man known only to the skilled in a particular profession in the city of London. The American enthusiast, on a pilgrimage to the shrine of his most admired and worshipped English author, has been heard to express his keen surprise when he lighted at last on the object of his ardent devotion in an 8-roomed cottage among the remotest recesses of suburban Middlesex, or ran him to earth in a dingy stucco-fronted family residence of the eligible order of architecture, lost among the monotonous and dreary desert of a London back street. How does it come, then, that these things are so? Why in this one particular trade should comparative fame and considerable reputation bring with it so very little in the way of substantial and solid reward as pounds sterling, too, in the net, viewed as a mere abstract problem of political economy? For I wish to be impartial, the question is this: why should authors earn so much less than the average wages of like intelligent labor? Why is literature the very worst market now known to humanity into which any man can bring for sale a given finite quantity of brains and industry? To these questions, familiar at least to the trade itself, authors as a rule have given a large number of assorted and equally foolish answers. The rapacity of the publisher, the harmless, necessary publisher, the most indispensable of go-betweens, the most justifiable of middlemen, has oftenest been made the innocent scapegoat of literary economics. American copyright laws, Mr. Moody, and the penny newspapers, have also borne their fair share of literary objurgation. To me, however, it seems quite evident that the real reason for the low rate of literary wages is a very different one. Authorship is, in fact, the only trade in which men suffer from the competition of the dead. And what is more, and more fatal in its effect, the dead are always at the head of the profession. This fact implies at once a broad and very painful difference between the position of the author and the position of any other member of an educated profession. The author can hardly, by any possibility, hope to reach the top of the tree or anything like it in his own calling, during his own lifetime. The dead forever block the way against him. If you want to entrust a difficult probate case to competent hands, you can no longer call in the aid of Lord St. Leonards. If you want the best advice on the state of your health, you must consult, not the recently deceased authority, but some living Gull or Jenner. As the elders drop off in each other profession, the younger men necessarily and naturally come to the front and take their places, everywhere but in literature. It doesn't much matter that the public often doesn't know the new men's names. The members of the profession and the people most interested in securing their services know them very well, or get to know them. People must needs rely upon the best of its kind then and they're actually forthcoming. In all trades, in short, except literature, a living dog is better than a dead lion. But in literature alone, owing to the peculiarly permanent and special nature of the work done, and the ease with which it can be copied and diffused ad infinitum, the living dog, nay, even for the most part the living lion, is hardly in it. To be sure, there are fortunes made in literature, by a lucky few, especially towards the end of their life, but these fortunes are in most cases comparatively small, and they are confined in almost every instance, save those of charlatans, to the very princes and leaders of the profession. I could name if I chose, did not the modesty of English prose forbid, barristers, doctors, architects, painters, hardly known at all outside a narrow professional or critical circle, who are earning 3 and 4 times the incomes earned by distinguished men of letters of worldwide reputation. Were a comparative list made of 3 or 4 such classes, and reputation pitted against reputation, outsiders would indeed be surprised to learn for what beggarly wages well-known thinkers, poets, or romancers were pouring forth essays, verses, and novels. I know one case, indeed, of a writer almost universally praised and admired over 2 hemispheres, who told me, long after his best work was done, that he had never yet made in a single year more than L300, all told, by all his writings. The key to this seeming paradox is not far to seek. By the very nature of the case, the men who write books which the printing press scatters broadcast at once over land and sea, books which are read by hundreds of thousands who never see the author's face, get widely known over every continent. Nobody at San Francisco, probably, is acquainted with the name of a single leading London barrister or architect. But thousands of people, I will venture to lay a modest bet, in the remotest parts of Montana or South Africa, know fairly well the name of almost every literary contributor to the last 12 numbers of this review. Yet even so, the diffusion is not necessarily very effective, from the author's point of view, at least. It means nothing. A surprisingly small number of copies of a book, in the case of a serious or scientific work how surprisingly few would be almost incredible, suffices to bring it well within the reach of pretty nearly everybody who cares to read it. Circulating libraries, the British Museum, Tauchnitz editions, American piracy, do the rest, and the author, poor soul, laudature et allegit. With law, medicine, practical arts, it is all the other way. The names, to be sure, are not known, there is little to diffuse them, but when the particular piece of work wants doing, they get hunted up, and the purchaser must pay the market price for the very best workman then and there in the market obtainable. In literature, however, in spite of all this wide diffusibility, effective reputations grow very slowly, and there is no special incentive of private interest to make the general public seek out and employ rising talent. Men read and buy for the most part the books of the people whose names they know, and have long known best, and they know best the names of those who have been the longest before the public. Hence it very rarely happens that an author earns a decent income during his own lifetime, and when he begins to earn after his death, it is the publisher, that far-sighted mortgagee of his brains, who reaps in the long run all the benefit. 3. Art, you say, is in the same category, surely, for there, too, are not the dead always at the head of the profession? Not quite, the cases are by no means exactly parallel. It is true that Raphael's, Michelangelo's, Leonardo's sell today at higher prices, though not at very much higher prices, than Leighton's, Watts, or Alma-Tadema's. But there is not anywhere any large stock of Raphael's and Michelangelo's now on sale, and the demand for such things far exceeds the effective supply at any given moment. Once more, there's nothing in art which answers at all to the power possessed by the printing press of indefinitely multiplying in exact facsimile the masterpieces of literature. How about engraving? Asks the cheap objector. But engraving doesn't go in the least on all fours with the case of printing. If you buy a Hamlet, a Paradise Lost, a Vanity Fair, a Pickwick, you buy the very identical play, or poem or novel which Shakespeare, or Milton, or Thackeray, or Dickens originally composed. If you buy an engraving of any of the pictures in the Tribuna at the Uffizi, you buy, not a Raphael or a Francis Angelico, but merely a colorless and inferior copy. The fact is, the artist has 2 strings to his bow, the author only one. The artist has both original and copyright, while the author has copyright itself alone. And in the artist's case the original is far the more important of the two, while in the author's case the original manuscript is for all practical purposes mere waste paper. And here again the difference is fundamental. Art always commands a high price in the market because the artist plays, unwittingly and unwillingly, but still perforce plays, upon one of the meanest and smallest of all human feelings. I'm not blaming him for it, I merely note the fact as a fact of nature. He appeals to the hateful monopolist instinct of humanity, especially of rich and ostentatious humanity. He indirectly and unconsciously pampers the vulgar tastes of such people as dukes, and brewers, and cotton spinners. What these men mainly want when they buy a picture is a means of displaying their own wealth and their own munificence to the remainder of their species. If they could buy the monopoly of a play of Shakespeare's or a novel of Scott's, frame it and glaze it in a handsome style, and hang it up as a decoration in their own drawing rooms, with the right to say to all their acquaintances, in a pompous whisper, "This is the masterpiece of the great so-and-so, I picked it up, dirt cheap, for £100,000 in Fleet Street," then literature, too, would profit by their odious foible. But unfortunately the manuscript of a new novel by Besant is not decorative, and nobody would care to read the book, however neatly written, in the author's handwriting. A picture, on the other hand, has immediate interest, and when you buy it and hang it on your wall, you know you have got what nobody else on earth can duplicate. The stock of old masters being necessarily limited, new masters also have their chance of favor. But who will care to buy a new book by a rising author when he can get the pick of Thackeray, and Dickens, and Carlyle, and Macaulay any day for a shilling? Hence the first great disadvantage under which the trade of writer lies is simply this, that the competition of the dead, here and here only, is overwhelming. I might add, if I liked, that this natural tendency to feed the mind mainly upon the literary work of past ages is as bad for the reader as it is fatal for the writer, that the best literature for any generation to nourish itself upon is the living, breathing, actual literature of its own contemporaries, that the cheapening of old books helps not only to stifle new ones, but to retard the intellectual development of the whole community, that men read old and worn-out thought that has had its day and done its work in the world, when they ought to be taking in the fresh, new ideas, the living leaven of future progress and future evolution. But I refrain from such folly. The wise man never utters one half of what he really thinks. Most of us who scribble have suffered severely enough already in all conscience for expressing a far more modest fraction of our true opinion. So I say no more. Let us not cast our pearls any longer before the faces of the gentlemen who review reviews in the weekly papers. 4. The first great reason, then, why the author should be so badly paid for his toil is the competition of the dead, and the consequent comparatively small demand for living literature. The second, which operates even where a specific piece of work is wanted to order at a fixed price, depends upon the fact that literature is least of all trades a closed profession. The lawyer, be he barrister or solicitor, has to pass many years, and many examinations, in preparation for his future work in life. The physician, the surgeon, the parson, the engineer, all require a special training and special credentials for their particular functions. But any man, or woman, who can hold a pen and spell decently, I am credibly informed even the latter qualification is politely waived in the case of ladies, can become an author at his, or her, own sweet will. It must be so, of course. A competitive examination for the post of novelist would be too grotesque, but the inevitable result of this open career upon the wages of the trade, viewed as a trade, is simply that the price of literary labor goes down on the average to the minimum price of unskilled labor of the clerkly kind in the general market. A trade so open to all the world as this is naturally exposed to the incursions of the amateur, and what is oddest, the amateur in this trade alone stands at no possible disadvantage. Quite the contrary, he carries into the trade his outside reputation. Nobody would entrust the management of his case in the Queen's Bench to the Archbishop of Canterbury. But if a great doctor, a well-known soldier, a popular painter, a familiar singer or actor or beauty writes a book, it sells, not only as well as the average book of the professional author, but a great deal better. The name of a lord, or a cabinet minister, or a fashionable preacher, or a momentary lion, the comet of a season, or the cover of this review itself, draws far more, I venture to guess, than the name of the ablest essayist or the deepest thinker now working regularly on English letters. And apart even from these occasional intrusions of the outside public into the professional preserves, there is the further fact that a vast deal of journeyman literary work is turned out by unprofessional hands, or by people who eke out small incomes, fixed or otherwise, by writing for pleasure in their leisure moments. Such writers can naturally afford to take a smaller price for their occasional services than the professional author, and their competition tends still further to depress the wages of a trade already more than sufficiently depressed by the unique and abnormal competition of the dead. Under these circumstances it is easy to understand why no man outside the walls of Colney Hatch ever voluntarily and deliberately devotes himself to the trade of authorship. Of course there are people who write books for the love of it, that is quite another thing. Most authors, if they came into 10,000 a year, would doubtless go on writing books themselves, the books they want to write, not the books the public asks of them. But no man, probably, ever became by choice a professional writer, a bookseller's hack, as our ancestors bluntly but forcibly phrased it. A trade so ill-paid and so overworked would gain no recruits, except for dire necessity. Men are driven into literature, as they are driven into crime, by hunger alone. The most hateful of professions, as a profession, I mean, it becomes tolerable only from a sense of duty to wife and family, or the primary instinct of self-preservation. The wages are low, the prizes few and often fallacious, The work is so hard that it kills or disables most men who undertake it before they arrive at middle life, while above all, to the sensitive mind, and most authors are constitutionally sensitive, there is the annoying liability to censure and criticism which meets your most honest and careful work at every street corner with blunt obtrusiveness. In most other walks of life men only hear what is said for good about them. People are polite, or at least are reticent. In literature, as in politics, the most modest and thinking of men must perpetually submit to hear his intelligence, his taste, and his personality discussed in public with charming frankness, in plain print, and in every journal. If men think him a fool, they don't disguise the fact, they tell him so plainly. If they think him a snob, they inform him to his face of that pleasing belief with brutal sincerity. Probably most professional men of letters, if they told the truth, would admit at once they would give their right hands never to be compelled any longer to submit themselves to this painful ordeal of public quizzing. Why, then, do men write for pay at all? Well, because they must live somehow. The profession is recruited almost entirely, I believe, from the actual or potential failures of other callings. The man who has knocked in vain at all other doors, or the man who has not capital enough even to approach any other door with the silver key which alone admits to the outer vestibule, takes as a last resource to literature. Some of us are schoolmasters or colleges tutors, some of us are doctors who fail to draw patients, some of us are stick-it ministers or disfrocked parsons, a vast proportion are briefless barristers. When a man who knows how to put an English sentence grammatically together has no other resource left in life, he sells himself, body and soul, in the last resort to the public press, and produces the fabric they call literature. Novelists in particular are probably always made, not born, being in this respect the antipodes of the poet. Divine bards sing because they must, but I suppose no man ever took by choice to the pursuit of fiction. Fellows drift into it under stress of circumstances, because that is the particular wear most specially required by the market at the moment. Women, it is true, often ardently desire to write a novel, but that is because they mainly read little else, and literary aspiration in their case, therefore, naturally betakes itself in that particular direction. To be an author and to be a novelist are them identical. But the literary aspirations of an educated man generally lead quite elsewhere. It is only the stern laws of supply and demand that compel him in the end to turn aside from the Lord's work to serve tables for his daily sustenance. V. And this brings me to a further deplorable result of these economic conditions governing the unfortunate trade of authorship, the only trade pursued by educated men which requires neither capital, nor credentials, nor special training. The result, I mean, that the author himself, viewed as an economic unit, must aim, above all things, at suiting his market. This is a truth as clear, from the economic point of view, as the truth that the baker, the grocer, and the producer generally must produce what the public wants to buy, not what he himself thinks would be best for the public. There is no way out of it, work it how you will. He can't possibly force the market. You may not like the conclusions of political economy are usually distasteful, but, like it or lump it, it is true nonetheless. We have to deal here with a crowded trade, in which competition is exceptionally and fatally severe, a trade which kills off its workmen faster than any sweating system ever designed by human ingenuity, a trade compared with which, I speak seriously, matchmaking and silvering and house painting and coal mining are healthy and congenial light occupations. Paternoster Row, as every passerby must surely have observed, is white underfoot with the blanched and mouldering skeletons of its victims. The hours are long, the strain is severe, the pace is killing, and the pay is inadequate. In this trade, therefore, unless a man produces the precise subject the public wants, for a public exceptionally fastidious and capricious, he goes to the wall as sure as fate, and the black earth yawns hollow below to receive him. Of course most men, in spite of the public, have their own fancies and their own likings. The best of us are human. Your native taste may be all in the direction of barlams and buttercups, you may love to babble of green fields and to purl melodiously in limpid prose of purling brooks, but all that is naught. If the public of the moment demands sensation you must throw the Whitechapel murders into the shade with your paper atrocities, and revel in human gore with a cheerful face, as though you much preferred that unpleasant medium for your morning tub to any less clammy and sanguine liquid. Or your natural bend may be all for tragedy. You may pant to ennoble the buskined stage, and to purify the souls of Mr. Moody's subscribers with Aristotelian correctness by fear and pity. But if the public has detected in you some faint undercurrent of amatory vein, you must exhibit Aphrodite, robed round with nothing but the world's desire, on every page of your glowing verse, or must unravel the tangles of Neraya's hair through 3 long volumes, till you're sick and tired of it. The people want to be amused, and amused it will be in its own way, in spite of you. Just now that way is hacking dusky South African flesh into small pieces, and all the fiction and imagination of the age must needs warp itself from its predestined path to gratify this jejune recrudescence of barbarism, this morbid taste for blood and thunder in literature. There's no help for it, no way out of it. As a plain matter of political economy, the facts are these: innumerable workers possess the field. Competition is keen, success is difficult. If you don't supply what the public wants, somebody else will step in and oust you, and the somebody else will survive in the struggle for life, while you go to the wall or into the workhouse. That is the gospel according to Darwin and Malthus applied to art. Soltivit et placuit is all the epitaph you can ever hope for, and not to please is simply fatal. But high aims in art, the noble desire to elevate and train the taste of the people, have we not heard that great artists must create the faculty by which they are to be appreciated? And so forth, with variations innumerable. Now, let us be serious. I am speaking here, not about great artists, but about the common and respectable trade of author. There are authors who do not depend upon the trade. Those lucky dogs can please themselves if they like in this matter, and I don't doubt that in the end they often succeed in pleasing the public also. Ruskin is a splendid case in point. Others occur, but, mindful of the dignity of British prose once more, I refrain from naming them. In such instances the author's subsistence is secured meanwhile, and he can go on writing the way he chooses, and as long as he chooses, till he secures his public as well. But what is the use of waiting for your public, if you die of starvation yourself in the meantime? Moreover, it must be remembered that most authors can't print what they like at their own expense. They haven't the capital. They are dependent upon publishers, editors, booksellers, proprietors, and those sensible people, sound business heads, will only print the sort of stuff they expect to pay them. All this talk about its being the duty of the author to elevate public taste, and see, belongs to a purely ideal world, where political economy and the struggle for life have not yet penetrated. In the actual practical world we all live in, the author must work for his daily wage like any other journeyman laborer. If he pleases his public, he earns his salt. If he doesn't please it, open the doors, and exit. You might as well tell the baker's man, as he goes his round, he should aim at elevating the taste of the back streets by supplying the people with Vienna bread and French rolls of the daintiest pattern. How is he to get the flour and machinery to turn them out? And supposing he does, of what use would it be if the back street folks have no money to buy them with, or don't want them? Of course there are always a few authors who insist upon following the intuitions of their own genius, and who sometimes succeed, with iron constitutions, in pulling through, in spite of everything, but far more often they faint by the way and perish in the attempt, to receive payment thereafter, at the public expense, sumptuous but unsatisfactory marble monuments. These are the martyrs, and martyrdom is always an edifying spectacle, but it isn't practical, and moreover, in most cases, it isn't even right. A man may be ready enough to starve himself, but the better part of us have given hostages to fortune, and there is more real heroism in toiling on uncomplainingly at distasteful work for those hostages' sakes than in making your wife and children starve with you uncomplainingly because, forsooth, you are a heaven-born genius, and must give free play to the inspiration within you. The first plain duty of most plain men is to discharge their responsibilities to those who are dependent upon them. Martyrdom is a showy and effective business. It brings down the house at the close with a rush, but a modest sum put away in the 3% commends itself rather as an aim in life to what is, after all, the highest morality. Not that there are not heroic instances on the other side. One there is of a great thinker who resolutely devoted his small capital and years of his life to the development of a philosophical system, on which at first he wasted himself in vain, with no return and little sympathy, till at last, after many days, the world of a sudden woke up with a start to find him acknowledged as its profoundest teacher. But, then, the great thinker had that little capital to start with. He had no family ties, he stood alone in the world, to sink or swim, and he resolutely determined to spend himself in the effort. That was heroism if you like, but heroism possible or praiseworthy only in a few exceptional instances. A trade can't be carried on upon such terms as those, it must keep alive its workmen, and the workmen can only be kept alive by pleasing their public. It is one of the minor annoyances of the author's life, indeed, that the world at large can never be made to recognize this plain fact, but constantly insists on identifying the writer with his books or his articles. It takes for granted that he writes what he likes, and that he chooses his themes because he is personally interested in them. Sometimes it scolds him for his evil selection. "Oh, how can you write such horrid things?" Or, "Why do you always make your plots so dreadfully bloodthirsty?" while he, poor innocent soul, with his finger in his mouth, would probably far prefer to spin out a pretty idyllic story about the domestic loves of two nice young people, who after many vicissitudes were happily married, or to enlighten the world to the best of his ability on the precise relations of the double stars to the unresolved nebulae. They little know that at that very moment a note from an editor, supreme arbiter of fate, lies open upon his table. "Why don't you give us a little more incident? Couldn't you manage, now, to kill off Guy and let Ethel's throat be finally cut after a desperate struggle by the insurgent Zulus?" But oftener still, and this is far more annoying, the world makes little complimentary speeches. "That was a sweet story of yours, good heavens. The trial of the Ruddigore mystery. Or how I did laugh over that clever essay on the ethics of bores." Pumped up perforce with a nervous headache in response to an urgent demand from an employer for a humorous article. What is worst of all, the world even writes you earnest argumentative letters about the precious subject on which you have last written, as though you cared for it. "Have you seen my pamphlet on the South Australian corn question? Or do you know that there exists at Rome a more perfect copy of the Apollo of Lysippus than even the one you praise so highly in your interesting paper on the development of the plastic art in Corinth? Why, that tedious article was written to order, for the editor of a leading art magazine, and you take about as much personal interest in the plastic art of Corinth or of Corioli, as a shoemaker takes in the metatarsal bones of this, that, or the other particular customer. You mugged it all up, as Mr. Potts's young man mugged up the subject of Chinese metaphysics, and as soon as you had delivered your soul, according to contract, of the 5,000 words, neither more nor less, sufficient to embed those 8 interesting engravings in a shallow stratum of insipid letterpress, you dismissed the plastic art of Corinth for good from your mind, with a fervent hope that no malignant influence would ever compel you in an evil hour a second time to approach the dry details of Hellenic sculpture. Cynicism. Ah, no, despondent realization of economic law. These are the conditions under which alone the author by trade necessarily lives. But do you think he likes them? Incredible. Impossible. For the author, too, has had his day of illusion, you may be sure. There was once a time, long, long ago, when he thought he might say what lay nearest his own heart, might speak out to the world, for good or for evil, the truth that was in him. Never mind whether the truth was worth speaking or not, to him at least it was all important. Hard experience alone has knocked all that out of him. And to the end, for the most part, he kicks against the pricks. He hates the sordid, squalid necessity for earning his bread by lowering himself to the tastes of the public he must needs serve with its daily literature. Slowly and painfully he learns to take his place beside the maker of hats and the importer of latest Paris fashions, as a unit in a trade that lives by pleasing. Perhaps pot-boiling is his true function in life, but he at any rate must have other ideals and other interests. For the author has usually aims and aspirations and theories of his own. The very ability which enables him to spin words into pretty phrases that take the editorial mind by their freshness, implies as a rule tastes, feelings, and sympathies above the common. If he could, He would gladly say what he has deepest and the most earnest within him. He would give the people of his best. But when he tries it on, the people too often turn it over listlessly at the railway bookstalls, and say with a yawn, "We prefer his shilling shockers, thank you." And most of us have tried it on, every now and again. We have listened, as advised, to the intuitions of our inspired genius. The publishers, to be sure, looked askance at our work. They shook their capitalist heads ominously. Never mind, we have a few hundreds of our own laid by. The spoils of the Philistines from those shockers aforesaid, let us publish at our own risk and expense. Steeth will print it. Alas, alas, how flat that work fell, in which we tried to elevate the taste or improve the morals or intellect of the public. The public chose rather to keep its taste and morals at its own dull level. A loss or two of this sort soon taught us wisdom. We accepted our true place in the world. We boiled the pot, if not cheerfully, yet resignedly. We began to feel the pulse of the market. Most of us never quite succeed in catching it, to be sure, that pulse is so capricious, or we ourselves have such insensitive finger ends, that we fail exactly to synchronize somehow with its erratic movements. But we get near enough to make both ends meet approximately. That modest result amply suffices for the average ruck of a hard-worked but eminently humble and contented profession. The fact is, as the world is constituted, to say out in full what you actually think about anything is simply fatal. You must write always with one eye askew upon 10,000 foolish popular prejudices. Especially in England, to hold opinions about any really great and important subject, about the relations of man to the cosmos, for example, to space and time and energy, to earth and ocean and plant and animal, or again, about the relations of man to woman, to the child and the family, to the past and the future, to the evolution and ultimate perfection of the race, any question, in short, of politics, or religion, or social science, or sexual morality, in the least degree above the opinions vulgarly held by the bourgeois mass of our Philistine fellow countrymen, is nothing less than damning. To have ethical theories superior to the morality of the grocer, the baker, and the Baptist minister, to have views of life more comprehensive than the views of blushing 16 in the rectory drawing-room, is to write yourself anathema. On all these subjects, all the subjects about which it is worth giving an opinion at all, the world doesn't want to hear anybody's opinion, it wants to go on uncriticized and unthinking, on its own commonplace banal level. But the great geniuses said their say boldly and made their mark, and pleased in spite of it. Of course. What can you not do if you are a great genius? That is small consolation to those hard-working souls who are not geniuses, and the rank and file of every profession can never hope to be all field officers. What is the use of telling the corporal who finds military cheer in barracks hard, that at the officers' mess they fare sumptuously every day off champagne and turtle? Yet even amongst the great geniuses of the world there have been no doubt 4 classes. The first is the class who could afford to wait and bide their time, who were not of the trade, who cared little what the world thought of them, who would go their own way and say their own say, and care for no man. The second is the class who perish in the attempt. The Chattertons and Keatses, the Brunos and Dolitz, the noble army of martyrs whom few can follow. The third is the class of lucky hits, the men who early take the public fancy, like Dickens or Hugo, and can do thenceforth pretty much as they like. The fourth is the class of those who deliberately set themselves to please, and succeed at last by dint of their genius in pleasing royally. To most journeyman authors, however, literature is simply a hard trade, governed like any other by the cruel laws of supply and demand. The one glorious possibility the craft encloses is the stray chance of a hit, one of those sudden jumps whereby a man's price goes up at a bound from hundreds to thousands, by some inexplicable whim of public fancy. Every workman in the literary trade lives in a perpetual deferred hope of accomplishing some day such a grand revolution. It is this strange gambling element of the craft that keeps him at times from losing heart entirely when things look blackest. It is this that reconciles him to the homely, slighted shepherd's trade. Every now and then he sees one of his friends burst out in this wise into sudden blaze, often with a work no better than many of his previous good works which the public slighted, sometimes, indeed, by no means with his best one, and why may not he too in his turn do likewise? To the journeyman author that chance, if ever it comes, means not only a competence, it means also, what is dearer by far to him, emancipation, freedom. For when once an author has attained success, he is free indeed. He may say what he likes. He may tell the truth at last, and no man will curb him. From its favorites the public will suffer anything. Carlyle gave it abuse, Ruskin gives it nonsense, but it smiles benignly. That long self-repression will be all at an end. That drudgery of applying his noblest faculties to work that he hates will all be over. He can bring out after all his great work on the celestial parallax, or can explain his heretical and unpalatable views on the population question. He can even publish his epic poem, or print the tragedy that the management of the Lyceum so unaccountably rejected. So at each fresh book his hopes rise high, surely the hit is coming now. He was fetched that thick-skinned ruminant the public, this time. Alas, the new venture falls flat as all its predecessors at Moody's, or has that modest book-selling success time that attends all through his best efforts to please the pachydermatous public. He has failed again to find the thin spot in the rhinoceros hide. To work once more, with foolscap in reams. Surely at last, with all his striving, he must find out exactly what that capricious many-headed beast really wants from him. Editorial note by Peter Morton. This remarkable article, published in the Fortnightly Review in 1889, has just been identified as by Grant Allen. It is not attributed in the Wellesley Index. It is a brilliant analysis of the professional writer's plight at the time, worthy to be set against Gissing's New Grub Street, A Scribbler's Apology, 1883. Editorial note by Peter Morton. A splendidly agonized piece about the true social worth of the journeyman writer's life, particularly the worth, if any, of the kind of tutelar which Allen represents himself as being. Published in the Cornhill in May 1883, opposite the little study window where I sit cobbling at my trade of scribbler every morning, a working shoemaker bends all day long at his bench over his monotonous task with awl and leather, fitting ready-made uppers on his wooden last to measured soles for country customers. It is a dreary trade enough in its way, no doubt, for it consists mainly of sewing the self-same triangular pieces into the self-same clogged boots, week after week and the month after month the long year round. Yet it must have a certain ethical compensation of its own, I take it. It must imply a more or less vague consciousness of something duly performed for humanity in return for board and lodging and social protection. That shoemaker is not in all probability a very profound moral philosopher. One may venture to doubt even whether he has ever tried at all to justify to himself his own existence and his own function in an overcrowded and underfed world, yet in some half-instinctive and embryonic fashion he must feel, I fancy, that he too is fulfilling his special office in the great economy of civilized humanity, that he too does his honest spell of good work in return for many and various benefits received. He is no idle guest at the banquet of nature, no mere dronish parasite at the table spread for us all by the joint exertions of the universal human race, by the Egyptian fellah and the Indian coolie, by the Iowa granger and the West Indian sugar planter, by the looms of Manchester and the whirring wheels of Birmingham factories. Like all the rest of us, to be sure, he labors chiefly for his daily wage. His first and greatest mainspring of action is afforded him by his pressing sense of his own necessities. Still, the labor he performs does not benefit himself alone. He must know and feel, however implicitly, that he is working for the common weal as well as for his own petty personal advantage. It is an undoubted benefit to civilized man that he should go dry-shod, and in those boots that my neighbor has made today, 2 human beings may go dry-shod in snow or rain or morass for at least a 12-month to come. You see a solid, tangible, undeniably useful result of his day's labor, something that brings him in his daily bread, but that keeps a couple more poor brother mortals warm and comfortable for many a day as yet unborn. If a supreme censor should ask him now on behalf of humanity to give an account of his stewardship for this present 24 hours, he could produce his 2 stout pairs of hobnail boots and say proudly, "Behold my handicraft." But if such a censor were suddenly to present himself in this snug little study, and, seating himself in the visitor's chair, were to ask the bewildered scribbler at this desk what he on his part had done for mankind in these same 24 hours, or, for the matter of that, in all his journalistic life, what could the poor abashed scribbler honestly make answer? With what face could he say, "I have contributed a column of political abuse to my daily paper, and I have written half an unfavorable review, for a weekly journal, of a foolish and vulgar sensational novel"? How blank and meagre a record that seems of a whole day's work by a man whose education and position ought surely to fit him for doing something better on behalf of humanity than the mere untrained and uncultivated shoemaker. Yet, if we look the thing in the face, we see at once that the shoemaker can point unhesitatingly to his pair of boots, a definite, visible, positive benefit to mankind, to be comprehended even by the meanest intelligence, whereas the scribbler can point only to a few dubious lines of printed matter, good type arranged in questionably useful order, and probably of very little advantages to any human being, past, present, or to come, save only the author who got 5 guineas for the trouble of writing it. And considering what a doubtfully honest trade this trade of scribbler really is, I often ask myself the question which the shoemaker has so little need to ask: have I, as a unit of humanity, any right at all to go existing? Am I, in fact, earning my own livelihood by any proper and justifiable means, or am I a useless head in the commonwealth of labor, offending against that prime law of economics, human and divine, that whoso will not work, neither shall he eat? Let us argue out this question quietly, pro and con, and let us see what can be fairly urged about it by a special pleader on either side. 2. My young friend Alastair Jones, who is a meritorious and enthusiastic minor poet of some rising distinction, would have very little difficulty in settling the whole matter offhand for us in a single florid oration. He would say that the existence of a literary class in every community was a necessity far higher than the necessity for mere earthly boots and mundane gaiters. Man shall not live by bread alone; in virtue of his very humanity, he requires a spiritual food as much as, or even more than, a physical subsistence. What is it that raises us above the naked savages except the possession of literature, of science, of art, in one word, of culture? No one of us would wish to relapse into the condition of the beatified oyster. Our consciousness of human superiority is too all-pervading to let us wish for any lower lot, however happy in its own way. Nor would we care for even the highest material civilization, if it were nothing more than materialistic. A perfectly comfortable Mongolian paradise is no paradise for such as you and me. Better 50 years of Europe than cycle of Cathay. Fancy for a moment a glorified and intensified American ideal. A world all made up of infinite turkey and illimitable pumpkin pie, a world full of circular sawmills, and Pullman palace cars, and mammoth hotels, and light blue satin, and white and gold drawing rooms, a world wholly given over to raising corn, and sticking pigs, and distilling old bourbon whiskey, and making vulgar love through its nose to vulgar, overdressed, underbred young women. Its one literature would be the editorial screamer, its one excitement, an annual boom, and a quadrennial orgy of presidential elections. Picture to yourself such a society, without any painters, without any thinkers, without any musicians, without any of those rare souls, poets whose thoughts make rich the thought of the world. My friend, Alastair, like most other young versifiers, has a pleasing sense of the important functions performed by his own class. And then just remember that that is what this earth would come to were it not for you and me and our likes, my dear fellow. Could anything be more jejune, more monotonous, more utterly lacking in any worthy final cause than a whole community of unleavened Philistinism, deprived even of the reflected glimmer which is catches now or then in stray places from a Shakespeare, a Milton, a Wordsworth, or a Shelley? Would you or I care to live in such a world? Would any man worthy of being called a man care to live in it? Would even the Philistine himself care for it? Does not he himself vaguely feel, after his amorphous jellyfish fashion, that these things which he cannot understand or appreciate are yet the very salt and savor of the earth? Does he not know in some indefinite way that without them all man, who is now a little lower than the angels, would become a little lower than the monkeys, a more perfect and consummate type of highly developed pighood? If you were to poll the entire mob of 6-pound householders, or for the matter of that, take a plebiscite by universal suffrage either, asking the people, the blind and battling multitude itself. Alastair is always cruelly hard on the proletariat, whether it would abolish literature, science, and art by a wave of its hand. Don't you think even the many-headed beast in person would thunder no? From all its blatant beer-besmirched mouths? I warrant you it would, for they feel dimly that man is what he is, not in virtue of corn and pork and high-pressure steam engines, but in virtue of his godlike brow and his beautiful, wonderful, human arts. We are talking always about progress, but is the progress we want merely one of more wheels and more chimneys? What for? To find employment for more children who will grow into more men and women, to feed more wheels and more chimneys, to provide for more mouths again in the next generation. Are we to solve our Malthusian problem by a mere universal extension of grain cultivation over endless prairies, where we can raise still more corn, to feed still more pigs, to be ultimately converted into still more corn-growing humanity, which may reproduce its own bucolic kind ad infinitum? If the world feeds us poets and thinkers, we give back to the world more than it can ever give us. Any man, with a pair of arms, can drive a plough or cure bacon, but not every man can write things which make the world better and great throughout all time and all eternity. Let us have shoemakers and pig-stickers if you will, but, whether or no, let us at least have a Homer, a Virgil, a Plato, a Newton, a Mozart, a Phidias, and a Raphael. 3. Now, this is all very well on Alastair's part, who, I believe, really thinks himself a great poet in posse. If you are quite convinced that your thought will positively add something valuable to the thought of the world, that you can say or do aught which will live after you to make future ages wiser or nobler, then I fully agree that you may eat your bread boldly at the table of humanity without any humiliating sense of unworthy or pauper-like dependence. After your kind you are laboring for your meat, and a high and enviable kind it most undoubtedly is. A Shakespeare whose imaginings gladden and ennoble the stray hours of millions in 100 generations, a Beethoven whose notes ring forever through our listening ears, a Darwin whose patient toil turns all the thought of the world into a fresh and fruitful channel. These men surely deserve better of humanity than the mere ignoble clod, too often purely coarse and selfish, who turns a virgin sod on some western prairie into desolate stretches of unfenced and unlovely cornfield. Even the lesser workers in the same arts or science, the men who turn out dainty little nothings in verse perfect of its kind, the men who paint us little sketches that beautify our meager middle-class rooms, the men who slowly frame the raw bricks of natural knowledge from which a Newton, a Cuvier, or a Spencer, builds up at last a stately and harmonious fane, even these, too, deserve to eat their bread in the proud consciousness of independence, as laborers richly worthy of their hire. Unless we are content to abdicate all our prerogatives as civilized men, to sink down into mere animal machines, fruges consumere nati, we must grant that such work as this has its uses, and those of the very highest. If there be anything on this earth worth living for, a moot point which I am far from wishing dogmatically to settle, that thing is surely culture in its fullest and broadest sense. It is that differentiates man as man from the helpless struggling herd of lower creatures. Yes, all this is very well for Alastair Jones, but it does not touch the ethical status of the mere hired scribbler and common journalist in any way. And even within that narrower circle, I wish still further to define and circumscribe. For I don't doubt that the newspaper in the abstract is a beneficial and a useful institution. It is true that, in the concrete, it has many defects, inseparable, I suppose, from all the best works of poor fallen human nature. Especially does it tend to diffuse a wide and general familiarity with the very worst and the most slipshod literary style, and to reduce the Queen's English to a common dead level of vulgar inaccuracy. Still, it is clearly necessary for people in a civilized country to be fully informed of what is actually going on about them, to be acquainted with the latest news from Egypt, with the last change of political balance in the minor chieftainships of Zululand, with the minutest details of the recent shocking murder in the Borough Road. Hence I will freely allow that the printers, the reporters, the editors and possibly even the leader writers, though here I am certainly stretching a point lest I condemn any man too hastily, have a fair right to existence in a civilized commonwealth, side by side with the butchers, the bakers, and the candlestick makers. Perhaps, who knows? In the wise dispensations of Providence there may be a final cause for the special correspondent in person. In the beautiful interaction of the social economy he too may fulfill some useful though unsuspected function. But the sort of scribblers I have specially in my eye at the present moment are those whom I am wont to call, in my own private dialect, the tootlers, that is to say, the good folk who write a tootle about nothing in particular for the mere gratification of idle people. Sometimes the tootle takes the form of a third leader, that wonderful social leader in all the daily papers, which begins with a fresh squabble in the St. Pancras vestry, goes on to consider the history of vestries in general from the days of the Stone Age onward, alludes playfully to our Aryan ancestors, digresses into the constitution of the Athenian dyms, discourses casually of Roman municipia, is learned on the subject of early French communes, and ends abruptly with an amusing anecdote of Gustave Courbet. Sometimes the tootle becomes a middle in a weekly paper, sometimes it assumes the guise of an amusing review, sometimes it presents itself to the candid reader as the present article. But whatever it may be, it always tootles merely. It contains nothing on earth really calculated to do any kind of solid good or impart any kind of serious information to any human being whatsoever. Now, the vast mass of our current literature consists entirely of such tootles, and the question naturally arises, has the tootler any sufficient excuse to give for his persistent daily appearance in answer to the clanging dinner bell of collective humanity? To this question I fear I must return a far more lowly and commercial answer than Alastair Jones's. The tootler can only reply that he fulfills a want. A demand exists, and he himself the correlative supply. People are ready to buy his wares, and he sells his wares to them accordingly. Perhaps he may turn out better wares, sometimes yes, sometimes no, but in any case he must turn out simply and solely what suits his market. After all, the phalansteries are not yet organized, the millennium has not yet begun, and the world in its present condition is mainly governed by the base, cold, hard, vulgar laws of supply and demand. The daily papers and the weekly papers want a certain definite article, and the tootler produces it for them at a fixed rate. He takes his guineas for work performed, and he seems therefore about as honest a man as the mason or the carpenter who builds for hire. His work may be shoddy, most likely it is shoddy nowadays, but it is the thing he is paid to do, and do it he must. The man who pays him wants just such stuff, not merely the simple middleman or intermediary whom we call the publisher or proprietor, but the real ultimate hirer, the consumer who takes a delight in the perusal of tootling. In this present workaday world of political economy and competing markets, the career open to talent is just the best career we can each carve out for our individual selves. We of the proletariat cannot be pickers and choosers. It is all very well for the rich man in his gilded saloons. He doesn't gild them now, since the aesthetic revolution, but no matter, it is all very well for the rich man to say, I will write a great epic poem, or, I will produce an epoch-making philosophical work, or, I will devote 10 years of my life to historical researches into the reign of King Burgard of Mercia. He has got his way made clear before him, and he can do as he likes in this as in other matters. But the poor man, and the mass of literators have always been poor, from the days of Grub Street onward, must take the first work that turns up to his hand, and if heaven ordains that he should become a special correspondent, he must e'en pocket his pride and endeavor to do his duty in that station of life to which it has pleased political economy to call him. 4. Yet this, to say the truth, is a very shallow kind of moral philosophy indeed. Would such an excuse as that serve my purpose, I should like to know, if some sea green, incorruptible reduster were suddenly to begin lopping off the useless branches from the social organism here in England? For ours, after all, is a serious world of struggling, hungry mortals, governed by natural selection and the survival of the fittest, in other words, by ever-pressing famine which picks out on the whole the weakest and least successful members with the unerring sagacity of blind mechanical law. If such a community, composed mainly of real workers and producers, of men and women who raise the bread and weave the garments that feed and clothe me, were seriously and solemnly to ask me what I had ever done for them and theirs that I should not be hewn down and cast into the fire like the barren fig tree, could I really give them any solid and satisfactory excuse for my continued existence? I fear not. The classes for whom I purvey entertaining leaders, or leaders meant to be entertaining, are not theirs. They are the classes with whom theirs have little or nothing at all in common. Tootling is of small use to the cobblers of Northampton, or to the saw grinders of Sheffield. It is the idle people of the world who pay me my penny for my day's labor. Probably there are few minor journalists who do not sometimes pause to think with shame or grief that they are ministering only to the pettiest amusement of a useless crowd, that they are pandering to the more or less unwholesome tastes of a set with whom they can have personally but very little literary sympathy. This, I take it, is the worst and darkest count in the whole indictment against professional scribblers, that they are scribbling not for the advancement of the world as a whole, not for the enlightenment of the struggling masses, not even for the more innocent amusement of the people who feed and clothe them, but simply and solely for the gratification of a class who have probably no reason whatsoever to exist, and whom the sea green incorruptible, if ever he comes, will educate out of existence with all convenient expedition. But this, you say, is rank socialism and nihilism of the most cutthroat sort. This is the talk of sheer Parisian communards and petroleses over their drop of absinthe in a Belleville cabaret. Oh, no, I hope not. My own ethics are far too dubitative and fluctuating to make me willingly cut any other man's throat for any supposed shortcoming in his performance of his social duties. I don't mean by these apparently harsh words to taboo utterly all the ladies and gentlemen upon earth. I only want to make my own calling and election quite sure. I can readily understand that there many a wealthy man in England who lives in a great house and keeps a great retinue, and whom mere unthinking nihilism would at once condemn as a double-dyed aristocrat, but who nevertheless has really done nearly as much for the cause of humanity as Messrs. Delisle, Rochfort, and O'Donovan Rossa. I don't for a moment deny that many a member of the richer classes in all countries, if asked to render an account of his stewardship, could point to great works of benevolence, of social organization, of industrial improvement, of agricultural progress, of education, of literature, of science, of art. Such people could pass their examination before the delegates of humanity in the first class with honors. I have no doubt, too, that there are many other humbler persons of the same rank who could show good work done in other ways, political, social, or domestic, which would at least enable them to scrape through decently for a pass degree. But I don't suppose, on the other hand, that anybody will deny the existence of many thousands of utterly idle and useless people in our midst, who have never done anything, and never will do anything, save eat, drink, and enjoy themselves in wholly selfish ways their whole life long. Now, I don't say that such people ought to be lopped off forcibly from the body politic, far be it from me, who am an individualist of the utterest school, and firmly believe in the divine right of everybody to be left alone in his own devices, so to coerce the acts and consciences of other people. Let the wheat and the tares grow together to the harvest. But the important point for each one of us is to make sure under which category he himself properly falls. It is one thing to say you do not interfere with a certain set of exoteric persons, another thing to say you will be one of them yourself. We are all for tolerating Multonians and Fifth Monarchy men, but we don't all wish immediately to join these eccentric sects, or to march up and down the streets with banners flying as full privates in the Salvation Army. I take it for granted, therefore, without being at all of a sanguinary or evolutionary disposition, that there are at this moment in England a vast number of people who cannot satisfactorily defend their own presence on earth in any way, and who, if only they had attained to an ethical standpoint at all, would either go their way and do otherwise, or else would cut their own throats for incorrigible vagabonds upon the spot. I take it for granted also that it is the obvious duty of every right-minded man to avoid being one of these, and as far as practicably possible, to avoid making his living by pandering to their useless tastes and selfish amusements. The only remaining question is this: can the scribbler be considered as sinning against light if he deliberately goes on scribbling for the classes in point, after he has once clearly arrived at this fundamental ethical judgment? v. When one begins to apply the rule, it becomes obvious, I think, that it cuts quite too widely for practical guidance. For after all, in the world as now constituted, with the majority of the wealth concentrated in the hands of useless, idle, and selfish people, which, in fact, we all admit in our soberer moments, it is difficult to see what else the proletariat can do but just silently perform the tasks which wealth demands of it. Consider, for example, that it is not merely the scribblers who are included in this condemnation, but whole thousands and millions of laboring men who spend their lives in making expensive articles of useless luxury for the very wealthy. Indeed, it is but a relatively small portion of the world's population that is employed in providing or distributing really useful things: bread, meat, clothing, science, poetry. The remainder are chiefly occupied in turning out mother-of-pearl card cases, malachite boxes, ivory-handled brushes, crests and monograms, or papier-mâché monstrosities, in preserving game, breeding bulldogs, manufacturing lawn tennis bats, or dressing young ladies' hair, in growing champagne, hunting seal skins, diving for pearls, grubbing for diamonds, shooting hummingbirds, or pulling out ostrich feathers all the world over. If we go into a big house, inhabited by one of Mr. Matthew Arnold's greater barbarians, we see nothing around us on every side but infinite products of wasted and misdirected human labor, for the most part not even beautiful, but owing their whole value and whatever paltry interest they may happen to possess to the amount of time and pains that has been unhappily expended on procuring them. The objects are mostly of what we call precious materials, that is to say, materials for the obtaining of which many individual men have backed their luck against the paucity of the supply, and have wasted their days in an ineffectual search, only 1 out of 100 ever getting a fair return for his time and labor, as in diamond mining. The whole place reeks of gold, silver, ivory, jade, agate, onyx, porphyry, and tortoiseshell. It slides and glistens with polished granite, marble, and lacquer. It dazzles us with mosaic, buhl, velvet, Russia leather, porcelain, bronze, and ormolu. If we take a turn round one of our great manufacturing towns, we find it wholly given over to the making of little electroplate shrines for the goddess of fashion, to the manufacture of jewelry, bloom of nylon, opera glasses, artificial flowers, photographic albums, or blue satin coverings for chairs with gilt legs and plaster moldings. If we drop down casually on any distant colony or dependency, we find black men and brown men shooting birds of paradise, hunting for rubies, extracting elephant tusks, growing dyes, cutting down mahogany, or fishing coral, all for the supply of the greedy, lazy, grasping, tribute-exacting European market. I don't say all these trades are necessarily bad in themselves, but I do say they are not a whit better than the trade of a scribbler who writes social leaders for the daily press. And what shall we say, now, as to the social ethics of these various occupations? Are they all to be condemned in a single sweeping and unswerving condemnation? Not quite, I think. There is an obvious distinction to be drawn between them. It is quite unlawful, as it seems to me, to belong to a trade which inflicts deliberate and wanton cruelty for the gratification of coarse and vulgar tastes. It is quite unlawful to bake tortoises alive, in order to make their shells the proper color, to dig tusker out of the jaws of a still living elephant, to slaughter mother seals by the thousand, leaving their babies to starve to death, crying piteously, with their almost human cry, upon the ice, to scale red mullet alive, for the sake of reddening them, to cram unhappy geese for pâte de foie gras, to massacre hummingbirds and sunbirds for fashionable hats, to perform the 1,001 hideous vivisections which no society has yet been instated to suppress, and which law itself expressly permits at the present moment, provided only they are not done for a scientific purpose. It is also obviously wrong, as it seems to me, to make use of any product so obtained, when once we know the way in which it has been produced, to eat Strasbourg pies, to wear ostrich feathers in a bonnet, to buy sealskin jackets, or bronze beetle necklets. I may be mistaken, but I fancy there must be a fiber wrong somewhere in the lovely women who still knowingly countenance all these unspeakable atrocities for fashion's sake. I always wish they could be made to realize the wrongfulness of their conduct by once being compelled to assist at the processes which have gone to make up their muffs and their bonnets. And, in the same way, I also hold that it is a low and a dirty trade for any man to purvey distinctly bad and degrading literature, literature calculated to make the world something wickeder and worse than it actually is, literature like some of the repulsive novels which we have seen more than once befouling the shelves of our libraries during the last few years. But apart from such actively wrongful trades as these, about which it seems to me there can be no ethical hesitation at all, I don't know that even the most rigid moralist can well object, at the present time, to the mere pursuance of a useless profession by needy members of the working classes. The condemnation would be a condemnation of circumstances, not of dispositions. It is a mere toss-up, at the present day, that makes Eliza Ann into the maid-of-all-work in an honest farming family, and Euphemia Amelia into the lady's maid of a baronet's daughter. It is a mere toss-up that makes Bill take to the plough, and turns Tom into the squire's gamekeeper. It is a mere toss-up that sends Bob into a cotton factory, and puts Jim into the cigar case making. The proletariat itself feels no distinction in this matter. Its moral sense is still many thousand miles away from the casuistry that would distinguish between such nice shades of rightfulness and wrongfulness as these. Our laborers all do what work they are paid for, and they think no harm, in their honest, uninquiring way, of their trade being, in ultimate analysis, a purely odious one. Nor, indeed, is it easy even for the casuist, and I confess to a turn that way myself, to draw delicate lines in such a very complex society as our modern English world. For example, it is obvious that a powdered footman is a purely useless and not even ornamental object of virtue, but it is not so clear whether a doctor's coachman is not subserving a useful function, and it would be difficult indeed to decide as to the exact value of London cabmen, from those who wait with growlers at the railway stations to those who drive night hansoms about the Strand in the theatres. Again, what shall we say concerning the vast army of retail distributors? What is the precise point at which a stationer's merges into a fancy shop, or at which crockery passes from the useful into the useless stage? All these things are hopeless problems for ultimate practical ethics, and they drive the despairing moralist to conclude that while things remain as they now are, each member of the proletariat must be content to make and sell, without question, such goods as are demanded of him by the superior classes. Like the early Christians, we must eat all meat that is set before us, asking no questions for conscience' sake, lest the answer should convince us that it is really meat offered to idols. Any attempt to do otherwise, to stick out for purest greed of strict utilitarianism, to refuse all work unless we feel sure it honestly adds to the sum of really earned human happiness, would be simply quixotic, and would necessarily lead to prompt self-effacement by the easy machinery of sheer starvation. That, I take it, is the one poor, weak, temporizing justification of the professional scribbler. I am an abuse, no doubt, and I know it, a mere useless excrescence on the face of society, but then there are so many abuses and so many excrescences that a single one more or less makes practically very little difference either way. The scribbler, too, is a member of the proletariat, a true working man, and for the most part a journeyman laborer. Like his fellows, he cannot pick and choose, he must take the work that the world imposes upon him. As a rule, he does not adopt his useless trade of malice prepense. He drifts into it unawares by mere stress of wind and weather, much as other laborers drift into other disreputable or laborious occupations. He has no time, when he first takes it up, to debate about its moral status. He hears the cry of a child in the background, whose crying is a cry for gold, and he writes for his life, just as he would dig canals or build a rich man's house, if he had the cunning. It is only later on, when increasing work paradoxically gives him leisure for indulging in the luxury of a conscience, that he finds time for ethical considerations. Then he sees the moral condemnation staring him in the face, and can only take refuge in the lame excuse, the last resort of vulgar dishonesty, that he is, after all, no worse than his neighbors. Why? And can the scribbler really urge no more than that on his own behalf? Is his best justification for his own existence merely the fact that he forms one of a large useless class, so large and so intricately intermixed with others that there is no hope of successfully weeding them out? Must he, add those, to him, far more important persons who are dependent upon him, go down quick into the pit as useless members? Must they be hewn down and thrown into Tophet alive, lest they cumber the ground that might else be supporting a fruitful crop of shoemakers and ploughmen? There are just two little excuses wherewith he may try to justify his being, two considerations which may possibly save him from the final limbo of empty windbags and do-nothing eat-alls. They are these. First of all, I will admit that I have all through been pretending to too much austerity, to far greater austerity than is really in me. I am not, in fact, so great an ascetic as I have made myself out to be. A world so terribly in earnest that it could never smile would be a world unendurable by human beings. On the other hand, it seems a horribly cruel thought that we should devote 1 acre of ground to any purpose of mere diversion while there are thousands starving for want of bread in our very midst. Why was not this playfield planted with corn, and given to the poor? Asks the ever-present politico-socialistic Judas within us. But on the other hand, just fancy a world which was also strictly and materialistically utilitarian, that it gave itself wholly over to growing bread and pork, making necessary clothing, quarrying coal, and catching codfish. What to us would be the worth of such a world at all? If we are human, we must have arts and pleasures. The merest savage makes a stone axe for himself, and then a tiny dolly axe for his baby boy. He has his dances and his corroborees, he paints his bright-hued pictures, and carves his rude bas-reliefs in leisure moments. Even in the pre-glacial age, we find him scratching figures of mammoths on bits of their own ivory, or drilling bears' teeth to make a savage necklet for his dusky squaw. All these feelings have become so ingrained in the very fiber of our natures that we should not be human now if we were born without them. An ant's nest is a perfect model of a purely utilitarian phalanstery. In it, all the exertions of every member are devoted solely to the construction and maintenance of the rest, to the collection of food, the care of pupae, the warding off of enemies, the keeping of aphids and other useful flocks and herds. There is no Formican literature, no Formican fine art, no Formican science. But man is not an ant, he cannot live by bread alone, and his life must be filled up with many small amusements and distractions, petty enough in themselves, yet absolutely necessary for his well-being. Suppose we were to occupy every field on earth with our corn and our turnips. Suppose we were to sacrifice all the beautiful wild beasts, all the graceful wild flowers, all the tangled thickets and copses. Suppose we were to make all our waterfalls drive grist mills, and to blast away all our rapids for the sake of improved navigation. Suppose we were to people every acre as thick as it could stand with human beings, each just sufficiently clad and fed and housed and lighted. What sort of world should we have made it into in the end? What a joyless, purposeless, truly bestial existence it would be after all, as bestial as that of the cow in the meadow, chewing the cud leisurely, and thinking placidly of nothing at all in heaven above or earth below or the waters that are under the earth. To you, no doubt, this all seems to perfectly self-evident that you wonder any man should seriously take the trouble to write it down in black and white. But it has not always seemed self-evident to many of us, and does not even now seem self-evident to the average social democrat among the working men. It is only with some effort that the awakened scribbler, endeavoring to justify himself to himself, to strike a treaty of peace with his own conscience, arrives at the conclusion that even he, as a wheel among wheels in a great social mechanism, fulfills a remotely useful purpose. What he writes affords amusement for a passing moment to a few people, most of whom indeed may themselves be useless, but some of whom may belong to the useful classes. I confess it was with a glow of pleasure that once in a third-class carriage I saw a workman in his muddy clothes reading one of the papers to which I contribute, and when I asked him why he bought it, received the answer, because I always read the articles about so-and-so, those being, in fact, the very series that I am engaged upon. And whether the actual distribution of the product is at present good or bad, at least the product itself is well meant, just as it is well that there should be paintings and statues and architectural works, even if many of them are still too much monopolized by special classes. The things themselves are there, and they are working up slowly, let us hope, toward a better future, and that brings me at last to my second and final point. Though I am not a poet, like Alastair Jones, there is a stanza of Shelley's which often suggests to me a certain grain of moral comfort when this sort of ethical dyspepsia oppresses my professional conscience in spare moments. Everybody knows the lines by heart, like a poet hidden in the light of thought, singing hymns unbidden, till the world is wrought to sympathy with hopes and fears it heeded not. Now, a journalist is not a poet, and heaven knows he is far enough from being lost in a haze of thought. Yet I sometimes think that even he, in his humble capacity of popularizer and suggester, may help to do something like what that last line so exquisitely shadows forth as the poet's function. There is one species of literature which everybody reads, the daily paper, and it is better that they should get honest thought, however inartistically expressed, than dishonest buncombe, better that they should get a little sprinkling of some useful knowledge than mere appeals to their worst feelings, better that they should be pointed onward and pointed backward, better that they should read such stuff as a decent third leader than that they should be wholly delivered over to endless and aimless political acrimonies. If a man is driven by fate into the position of scribbler, he may at least elect which kind of scribbler he will be. There are scribblers of whom one may fairly say that they take no heed at all of right or wrong, they produce just such articles as will please their audience, irrespective of ulterior tendency. But a scribbler may say to himself, in the rare intervals of thinking afforded him by his trade, I will at least in this my dubiously useful calling endeavor to abstain from doing any active and positive harm. Since the public will have journalism, and I am chosen by destiny as one of the instruments for supplying them with that doubtful article, I will make my work as little hurtful and as much helpful as I possibly can. I will give the people of my best, such as it is. I will never print anything which will aid in keeping back humanity on its old, half-brutal track. Where possible and when possible, so far as the medium permits, I will teach whatever little I know, and I will preach whatever I best feel. It cannot do much good, but it will not do any harm, and it may perhaps fall in with other influences to help on slowly toward the upward path. After all, what one individual can effect is always but little, and less in proportion to his personal obscurity. If he works decently well as a cogwheel fitting in with surrounding cogs, he has done the most that can be reasonably expected of him. And perhaps, to end the whole question, a scribbler who acts as far as possible up to these principles is on the whole, in existing circumstances, as a member of a confessedly imperfect and ill-organized society, earning his livelihood, not indeed, like the shoemaker, with a clear consciousness of social worth, but in a relatively harmless and unblameworthy fashion. With that negative sort of self-approval, it seems to me, he must be content to plod his way in the humble hope that at the end he may escape utter condemnation at the hands of collective laboring humanity.